I'm a biologist and frequently am by myself in remote locations. This occurred when I was 26 and somewhere between green and seasoned. I was surveying wetlands in a remote area of the Appalachians and in a region that is primarily dominated by thick pine forests. I always got on the county assessor site and printed off a map with landowner information so I wouldn't get tagged for trespassing. That'll get you shot. At this particular site, there was a driveway that ran through the U.S. Forest Service land, which is public. That allowed me to get into this area a little quicker. This driveway was absolutely public property. At no point did I trespass. I pulled onto this road that was clearly created by the USFS and pulled off to the side about 30 yards from this private entry gate. My vehicle was a state government marked vehicle. The forest is old-growth pine, but the outer edges of the forest is thick with undergrowth, forming a kind of wall before you get under the pines in a nice open understory. I walk about 200 yards in when nature calls. I make like a bear in the woods and do my business. I'm a biologist, so it's no big deal. Midway through, I hear yelling back at my truck. I think, great, now I have to deal with this. I'm wrapping up my business and getting ready to walk back to my truck when I hear gunshots. I stopped walking and thought, yeah, I'm not walking back to that. I was at a loss of what exactly I should do. I stood there for about a minute, considering my options, when I heard whoever it was breaking through the undergrowth on the edge of the forest. Shit, he's coming into the woods, I thought. Again, this is public property. I get this really bad vibe creeping up my spine, because this is absolutely the type of area where people just straight up disappear, and they do. It's very remote, and the communities are very closed. This county has more than double the amount of game wardens of other counties for a very good reason. I take off in a crouching jog, using my sense of direction to make it out to the main road about 600 yards away. More gunshots. Except these have a crack to them. That means they're coming in my direction. There's no way he sees me. But maybe he's hearing me. Maybe he's firing above my head. Adrenaline kicks in 100% now, and I'm moving with a mix of terror and urgency to get to the main road. I eventually make it and hide under a bridge. I call a colleague and give him the details of where I am, so they can at least find my body. I then call 911. This was the first time in my life that I ever had to call 911, and the operator doesn't believe me. But eventually I get in touch with a deputy, and he doesn't believe me either. He gave me this, they're probably just shooting tin cans bullshit. It's Sunday night, 7 p.m., and he's too lazy to get off his ass. I move further away into a public hunting area, and finally a game warden stops in. He took me seriously, and few of the locals came by and commented about how that landowner is an asshole. He was from Louisiana, and he's not a local. I got along well with most of the locals I had encountered, so this made a little more sense. After about an hour, the deputy gives me a ride back to my state vehicle. That son of a bitch is parked on an ATV and had a rifle laid across his lap, waiting for me in the dark. The deputy and I get out of the car, and I just walk straight to my truck and leave. It's almost 9 p.m., and I had a 4-hour drive to get home, and I just had enough. At the time, I didn't want to talk to the guy, but now I wish I had. Who knows what conversation the deputy and him had. After this, I quietly started carrying a firearm in the field with me at all times. I'm glad I trusted my gut feeling and insisted on a police escort back to my truck. That was not an encounter or conversation I wanted to have with someone with an overly active trigger finger. I had all the guy's contact information from the county assessor site, and I thought about mailing him a map clearly stating where his property begins and ends. But I just let it go. Maybe he thought I was some type of creep or something. Displaced Louisianian? Let's not meet. This encounter happened to a friend and a coworker of mine about 15 years ago. My friend, we'll call her Jody, lived in a suburb of Los Angeles, California, with her parents and older brother. It was a pretty nice neighborhood, and they didn't really worry about crime or break-ins or anything like that. One night though, at about 2 a.m., Jody was woken up by a loud knocking at the front door. She jumped out of bed and ran into the hallway where her parents and brother were coming out of their rooms. The knocking had turned into pounding. "Stay here," said her father as he made his way to the front door. All of a sudden, there came a muffled male voice shouting, "Help! Help me!" Jody and her mom grabbed each other in fear. Her dad looked out the peephole. "There's nobody there," he said. He then looked out the front window, where he could see part of the front door and porch. He still didn't see anyone. He walked back towards his family when the loud knocking started up again, this time more frantic. Again, a voice shouted, "Help! Help me!" Jody's dad went to the phone and called 911. And while he was talking with the operator, her brother had walked up to the front of the house. The pounding was still going on, getting faster and faster until it was a constant banging. "Help me! Help me! Oh God, help me!" At this point, Jody was in tears of fright. She looked over at her brother, who was standing in the family room, which was located to the left of the front door. His face was pale white, and he made an arm gesture for them to come join him. Jody, her mom, and her dad, who was off the phone with the police by now, hurried into the family room, where they immediately realized why her brother's face had gone completely pale. The pounding and shouting was coming from underneath the family room floor. The police arrived minutes later, and it turned out some guy in his 20s had gotten all out of his mind that night on crack and had somehow made his way under the house through a crawl space located underneath the family living room window. They never found out what his intention was, but they assumed he was trying to find his way into the house to rob it, but then got disoriented because he was so high and freaked out, hence the pounding and shouting. This story still gives me goosebumps to this day. I spent the first 10 years of my life in the city of San Jose, California. When my mother could afford it, she would take me to a theme park in the neighboring town of Sunnyvale called Great America. We went about once or twice a year. The rides were fun, the food was great, and I wasn't paying, so I had a good time whenever we went. Except once, when I was 7. About an hour or two into our day, I got that feeling. You know the one. When you get that sneaking suspicion that someone you can't see is watching your every move. I mentioned it to my mother and she said I was imagining things. We went on about our day and it was fun, as usual. But I couldn't shake that feeling. All day it steadily got worse, until I was literally begging my mom to take me home. Eventually she obliged, but she couldn't figure out what had gotten to me. Now, a little backstory. My parents got divorced when I was only a baby. When I was about 11, they reconnected and decided to get back together. And so we moved to a shitty little town up north called Eureka. My dad's dad, I refuse to refer to him as my grandfather, lived in that same town. He never talked to anyone, not even my dad. He was, in every sense of the word, a recluse. He passed away not long after we moved there. And my dad, being his next of kin, was tasked with going through his things. The first word that came to mind when we entered the house was paranoid. There was at least one rifle in every room of the house, sometimes 2 or 3. There was a Colt 45 under his pillow, and another under the driver's seat of his car, and a snub-nosed 38 in a Ziploc bag in the back pot of the toilet. Cameras were mounted on every exterior wall, and there were boxes upon boxes of VHS tapes with the collected recordings from these cameras, some of which were nearly worn out from repeated viewing. Suddenly, from the master bedroom, I heard my mom yell, "What the fuck?" My mom rarely swore in front of me, so I knew it had to be something serious. I ran to the bedroom, and what I saw in my mom's hand shocked me to my core. It was a photo of me and my mother, At the theme park, I was about 7, walking along with a corn dog in one hand and a drink in the other. I had a suspicious look on my face. I instantly remembered that day. My mother said that she felt faint and left the room. As it turned out, there were around 30 pictures of us from that day, as well as some from other times and places. Some of them were taken from within arm's reach. I've never felt so creeped out in my life. I don't know why he was spying on us, and I'm not sure if I want to. This incident happened about 7 or 8 months ago. I was the night shift desk clerk at a hotel, and let's just say that there was a steady stream of creepers that passed through the lobby. I've had a ton of uncomfortable situations throughout my 3 years of employment there, but there was this one particular guy that terrified me. It was around 2 a.m. when the guy walked into the lobby. The first thing I noticed was that he smelled god-awful, like burning plastic or something. I shrugged it off because at the time there were a lot of contractors that were in the area working on a chemical plant. I just assumed that he was a worker looking for a quick nap or a hot breakfast. The morning comes and my shift ends. Fast forward to my next shift, the following night. The smelly man from the night before left all of his belongings in his room, and he was nowhere to be found. He only paid for one night, so the housekeepers had to move his things to the storage room so they could prepare the room for the next guest. Around 8:30 p.m., I get a call from a police officer. Apparently, this guy was a wanted fugitive because he nearly beat his wife to death just 2 hours before he checked in. I informed them of the items he left in the hotel room. I get the whole "do not engage, he is dangerous and violent offender" speech, and now I'm officially scared. They said it was unlikely he would be back, but to excuse myself politely and call them if he showed up. Well, needless to say, he ended up back in the lobby not even 30 minutes later. He wanted the luggage he left. At this point, I'm doing whatever it takes not to show fear, because I'm now fully aware of what this asshole is capable of doing. I tried to play it off like I didn't know where his things were, so I could make an excuse to go upstairs and call the police. I'm not sure where they are. Let me go take a peek in a few of the storage units upstairs. If you could wait here in the lobby, I'll be just a moment. He didn't say a word. I assumed that he was fine with that, and I started walking up the stairs. Halfway up, I realized that he's following me. It was at this moment that I started to flip shit internally. I had no idea what to do, so I began to fake search through a few different closets. After about 10 minutes of this, he started to get hostile.
"Where's my shit? I need my things now. I need to go."
Then his fist goes through the wall. At this point, there was enough distance between us that I felt comfortable to make a run for it. Fumbling with my MasterCard, I managed to lock myself in the closest vacant room. He banged on the door a few times, but left shortly after. The cops came about 20 minutes later, but he was gone. They looked through his bags to find a stash of meth and drug paraphernalia, which explained the awful scent and his determination to follow my every step. I quit shortly after, and I'm still unsure if they ever found him. Every August, the county I lived in would throw a huge fair. There were games, rides, shows, food, and all that good stuff for about 2 weeks. Then they would take it down, and I would have to wait for another year. I want to say this happened in 2008. I was 7 at the time, and I was just tall enough to ride something I had wanted to go on for a long time. I convinced my mom to let me and my cousin Jared ride it. Jared was about 2 years older than I was, and my mom trusted us to be safe, so we ran off to the ride. After the ride, Jared had to use the bathroom. The fair only had porta potties, so I had to wait outside for him. That's when this man walked up. He said that I was supposed to go with him. I asked him why, and he just said that my parents said I had to. Now, I know I should have ran away or got Jared or something, but this guy said he knew my parents. It's an obvious lie looking back. He didn't even say their names. But I thought if he knew my parents, he wasn't a stranger. This guy started to take me out to his car. Now, to get to the parking lot of this fair, you had to walk a fairly long time, probably between 5 to 10 minutes. It's a huge field. It was a huge field where they had the fair set up. I asked him again where we were going. He said that we're going to go to McDonald's to get some food. The closest McDonald's was almost an hour away, and I had just eaten not long before that. So I said I wasn't hungry, and I wanted to go see my mom. I started to walk away, but he grabbed my arm and started walking me towards his truck. I froze. I knew that this was a bad guy now, but I was in some sort of state of shock, and I couldn't move. I remember trying to scream, but all that came out was a strangled whisper, and I can remember crying without making a sound. We were right near his truck now, and he was trying to force me into the back seat. When this young couple saw him, they must have seen me panicking and crying, because the girl ran right up and grabbed me and started screaming. The guy came over too, but the bad man was already in his truck. He literally ran over the guy's foot as he sped away. That young couple saved my life. I have no idea what the guy would have done to me if we actually got to where he was heading. I know it wasn't McDonald's. The couple walked me to the entrance, and the guy made an announcement that there was a missing child at the front. My mom and Jared arrived shortly after that. They were both crying. I remember running up to her and bursting into tears before whispering why she wanted the man to take me. She said she didn't know who tried to take me, and we hugged tighter and left. We didn't go back to the fair again that year, or at all the next year. My mom was paranoid that the guy was still there, looking for children. I got over this quickly and went on with my life. I only remembered this because my girlfriend wanted to go on that same ride last year. Back in the summer of 2012, when I was 11, I spent the night at my best friend Anna's house pretty frequently. She lived in a very wooded area, so her entire backyard could be considered a forest, and we loved playing in it, and I practically never went inside when I was at her house. Because her entire backyard consisted of trees, there weren't many places to put things like a trampoline, for instance, so they had to place it pretty far back in a small clearing. We were very naive kids and believed that nothing could happen to us in the woods. We were so sure of it that we played around in them at night as well. One night in particular, we decided that we would go play on her trampoline in the clearing. The trampoline was very old, and I was surprised that it could still hold people. It didn't have a net either, which I hated because I feared that I would go flying off one day and nothing would be there to catch me. We took off our shoes and climbed onto the trampoline. Something about jumping around in the dark was exhilarating. I was having a blast, but as we continued to jump, the atmosphere changed. I couldn't tell what it was, but the woods seemed darker and more intimidating than before. Anna stopped jumping and completely froze, staring off into a specific spot in the woods. I stopped too and looked at her. "There's a person," she whispered, pointing to the direction she was looking. My eyes widened, and I turned my head to look for myself. Sure enough, there stood a tall, shadowy figure of a man. He noticed and tried to slightly hide himself behind one of the thick trees. He was still visible though, and absolutely terrifying. We both stood frozen and unable to yell out or run. We just stared at him. He was a bit further back, but we could still see every movement. He slowly moved out from behind the tree. My eyes moved to his hand, and I could tell that he was holding something. I had no idea what it was, but it made the entire situation even scarier. Anna's senses finally kicked in, and she pushed me to move, screaming for her mom. I flew off the trampoline, making one big leap before landing hard on the ground. For once, I was thankful that there wasn't a net on her trampoline. Anna began to run, but I looked back first. The man had begun to run after us as well, and he was fast. I screamed like I had never screamed before, and I took off for her house. It felt like hours had passed before we reached her back porch. We threw ourselves into her living room. We were both actually laughing from hysteria, but the fear I felt in my stomach was sickening. Her mother, after hearing what happened, stomped onto the back porch and looked around the backyard. She couldn't see anything, but she yelled at them to get away while they still could. I'm happy to say that we never saw the guy again. Of course, going around the woods at night was never going to happen again, and I hope I will never have to experience another encounter like that for as long as I live. A few years ago, I was leaving my grad school office late around 10 p.m. to catch the bus home. I walked from the university campus through relatively busy well-lit streets to the main road in my area of the city, 109th Street in Edmonton. I was waiting for the bus at a shelter as it was in the middle of the winter, snowing, and a bit cold. The buses ran about every 15 minutes, so I wasn't worried or nervous, just patiently waiting to get home. I was listening to my music on my headphones when I noticed a guy walk up to the shelter. I looked at him briefly and did that little Canadian half smile of acknowledgement and went back to listening to my music and reading Reddit. A few minutes passed and I could hear him start talking to me. Well, I assumed that it was me, as there was no one else around. I looked up and he was staring right at me, smiling a bit oddly and speaking to me. I took out my headphones and said, "Excuse me?" He kept smiling and blathering on, asking me about my day, the weather, what I like to do, etc. I don't know what it is about me, but I'm a perennial people pleaser. I don't like confrontation, and my main aim in life seems to be keep the peace. So I answered a few of his questions as politely and as non-specifically as I could, with one earbud still in my ear. He just kept blathering on, and I just sort of nodded my head politely. He went on for about 10 minutes, and I just had this sinking feeling in my stomach about this guy, like something was just a little off, but enough to make me nervous. After about 10 minutes, I could see the bus rolling up, which was a huge relief for me. No one else had arrived at the bus stop, and I could see at least 10 to 15 people on the bus, which was great. I got on the bus and sat near the front, and the guy sat across from me so he could keep talking to me. I originally intended to head down to my house to the west of the street that I was on, but after this guy decided to be my personal parrot, I decided, screw it. I'm going to my boyfriend's instead, directly to the east of the street I was on. I was still getting a very uncomfortable feeling from this guy, so I decided to push the bus stop button to stop early and see what the guy did. The bus came to a stop at my request, and the guy got up. I didn't move.
"Isn't this your stop too?"
He asked me. I said, "Whoops, I must have hit the wrong stop." He looked at me and said,
"Oh, that's funny. I mixed it up too. This isn't my stop either."
And then he sat back down. At this point, I'm pretty freaked out. I hit the bus stop for the next stop and texted my boyfriend to come out and meet me at 109th Street. I got up to leave the bus once it stopped, and the creepy dude followed. I crossed the road, and he was still tailing me, still talking away at me, and still asking me questions. Once I got to the other side of the road, I told him that I had to go and that my boyfriend was meeting me. He looked irritated at the idea of my boyfriend and tried to walk with me a bit more, but I stopped and I told him that I was walking on alone.
"Can I have your number?"
he asked. I panicked and just froze. I decided to give him almost my number, just the last 4 digits scrambled. I read it off to him and said goodnight and started walking away quickly. I made it maybe 20 steps away and I could hear someone jogging after me.
"Hey,"
he yelled.
"I think there was a mix-up. I tried calling the number and it wasn't you."
He jogged up level next to me and was still smiling that same fucking smile, staring at me. How weird, I said. Grabbing my phone, I pretended to check it for a missed call and quickly texted my boyfriend that I was terrified and that he needed to get here now.
"So what's your real number then?"
he asked. I honestly don't know what I would have done. I think I probably would have given him my real number. I just had no idea what to do. It was cold, it was winter, and it was dark in this little residential neighborhood that I had entered, and I knew that I couldn't outrun him. Luckily for me, that was when my boyfriend came running up. He's 6'3" and somewhat imposing, and I turned to the guy and said, "Have a good night," and jogged up to my boyfriend and just launched myself at him. I didn't look back at the creepy dude, but I did tell my boyfriend to please make sure all the doors were locked and the windows were closed before going to bed that night. I grew up in rural Michigan and rode the bus to school every morning. We lived in a house at the bottom of a hill on a country road. My bus stop, however, was at the top of the hill after you passed my house. The story I'm about to tell happened when I was 7 or 8 years old. I woke up one morning and got ready for school like I usually did. My bus picked me up around 7 a.m., right when the sun was starting to come up. But there were still spots of darkness deep in the woods. I was the only kid who was picked up at my bus stop. So I would stand at the edge of the woods and wait until the bus came. My mom or dad would have to drop me off about 5 minutes before the bus came and hightail it to work in order to make it there by 8 o'clock. It's not that they felt completely comfortable doing this, but they didn't have many options. We lived in a safe area, or so we thought, and the bus arrived on time 99% of the time, so they weren't too worried that anything would happen to me in the 5 minutes I was left alone. So I'm standing there cold as shit, waiting for the bus to come, watching the sunrise slowly in the sky. It's still a little dark out, but not yet bright enough for me to see what's going on around me. I saw the lights of the bus in the distance, on time as usual, and it came to a stop right in front of me. My bus driver, Mrs. Teresa, opened the door and said good morning and gestured for me to hop on. I walked to my seat, put my stuff down, and noticed that the bus wasn't moving yet. Mrs. Teresa still had the door ajar. She just sat there, leaning slightly out of her seat, staring into the woods for a good minute or so. We were off and on our way to school after picking up a few more kids. After arriving at school, Mrs. Teresa escorted us in, which is something that she never did. And I remember seeing her slip into the office and talking to one of the secretaries. I went through my regular school day and I was picked up by my dad in the car rider line as normal. When he picked me up though, he started asking me all kinds of questions. Did the bus pick you up okay this morning? Did any car stop and blow their horn at you as you waited? Strange questions that he had never asked before. The next morning, my parents didn't take me to the bus stop. My mom dropped me off at school before going to work at a later time. This continued, alternating a drop-off by my mom or dad for the remainder of the school year. At the same time, I noticed they changed my bus stop. Years later, I found out why my bus driver went into the school that day and why my bus stop was relocated. When Mrs. Teresa picked me up that morning, she saw a man standing in the woods behind where I was. She alerted the school secretary, who alerted the transportation office for the school district, and then the police. The police investigated and found some items wrapped up in a t-shirt back in the woods. A hunting knife, rope, a rag or washcloth, and tape. The police never found out who that shit belonged to, but the bus driver, my parents, and the police felt certain that whoever it belonged to had the worst intentions. I think about this often and wonder what would have happened to me had my bus driver been a few minutes late, or had she not noticed the man standing in the woods after I boarded the bus. Because of this incident, the school district changed my bus stop to be located right in front of my house. That way I could stay in my house until the bus pulled up. No more standing by the woods for me. I resumed riding the bus the next school year. Okay, so this happened to me about 7 years ago, when I first started high school. The school was about a 10-minute walk away from my little brother's school, so every day I would walk up there to meet him. It was a pretty safe walk along a main road with lots of sunlight and cars, but not many people most of the time. Occasionally, you would get other school children or some runners, and some old people walking to their apartments, and of course, the people waiting at the bus stop. The bus stop was halfway between my school and my brother's, and there were only ever about 2 people waiting there. One afternoon, I was walking up to meet my brother. That day, I left my headphones at home, so I couldn't listen to music while walking, which is what I would normally do. So I was just walking and enjoying the sun. When I reached the bus stop, I noticed an old man sitting on the bench, waiting for a bus. I passed him and didn't think much of it, because he seemed harmless. I would say this guy was about 60 to 65 years old, pretty short, and not very fit. As soon as I walked past him, I heard him get up. I didn't see a bus coming. Maybe he was checking the timetable, but of course not. I turned my head to check, and this guy is like 5 steps behind me with his eyes stuck on me. I started to speed walk, but then I heard him speed up too. I looked behind me and sure enough, he's speed walking as well. I was scared. He hadn't taken his eyes off me, and now, whenever I looked back, he was giving me this creepy, devilish grin. There was nobody else around, and I was about 200 meters from my brother's school. I decided to book it. I looked behind me, and the old guy was now running after me. I couldn't believe it. He was faster than I expected too. Every time I looked back, he was staring and smiling. I was almost in tears. I was so scared that I wasn't going to make it. Now, I know you might think that a young teenage girl could outrun a man in his 60s, but with a heavy school bag and a messed up knee from gymnastics, I was about as equipped to run as he was. By this point, I could see my brother's school and some kids leaving. I was kind of relieved, and I thought the old man would ease up and notice that other people were around. But no. What does this guy do? He starts yelling to the people, saying,
"My granddaughter, she's running away from me. Get her, she's in trouble."
All the while giving me this evil grin. I then stop because I've come to a massive road and I don't want to get hit by a car. This guy gets close enough to grab my bag and tells me to stop being such a little cunt and that he was going to win and take me away. I screamed and ran for my life, not caring about the cars. I got to my brother's school and looked back to see the guy jogging towards me. I ran into the main building and told the receptionist what happened. She looked outside and saw a man waiting outside the school gate, moving his head around as if he was trying to spot someone. I told her that that was him. She then told me to wait with her while she called the police. The man walked away after about 10 minutes, but the police did catch him, and we found out that he had been offering candy to kids from my brother's school and trying to get them to come home with them in the afternoons. I walked on the other side of the road from then on, avoiding the bus stop and anyone I would pass. This encounter happened to my mom when she was in middle school in the early 1970s. Her family lived outside of town, so she rode the bus to and from school. She was in 6th grade and had a boyfriend who also rode her bus. They would sit together and hold hands, but they were not inappropriate with their interactions. The bus driver took notice of their relationship and started to make comments to them. He would ask if they kissed a lot, if they tongued, and once even asked him if he sniffed her underwear. Not knowing what to do, they just did their best to ignore him. On the last day of school, the bus route went as usual, except that the driver skipped my mom's stop. When he stopped at the next house several miles away, she tried to get off the bus with the girl that got off at that stop. The kids all knew each other pretty well and were friends. The driver stopped her and made her sit back down. Every stop after that, she would try to get off, and the bus driver would tell her to sit back down, until she was the last one left on the bus. She was already terrified and crying. She said that she didn't remember if she was praying out loud or not, but she remembers just begging for an idea of how to get away. The driver told her to move in front of the bus, right behind his seat. Instead, she picked up her things and moved to the very last seat. On her way, she set her books and things in the middle of the aisle, hoping that if he came after her, he would be slowed down. He finally started back down her road towards her house, but turned off onto a dirt road leading back to some brush. She finally decided that even if he slowed down enough, she was going out the back emergency door and running for it. As he turned down another dirt road leading deeper into the brush, she happened to glance out the back window to see her dad and her older brother and their truck following behind. She shouted up to the driver, "You better stop this bus right now. That's my dad behind the bus." He then stopped the bus and opened the doors for her to get off, but she was too scared to move. Within a few seconds, her dad was on the bus, standing right up next to the driver so that she could walk around him. He told her to go get in the truck with her brother. As she sat in the truck, she could see her dad through the back window, just going off on the guy, only verbally, unfortunately. When her dad got back into the truck, he hugged her like never before, and she just lost it crying. She knew that if her dad was scared, she had just escaped with her life. Now, this wasn't just a coincidence that her dad had found her. Every kid who got off the bus after they missed my mom's stop had gone home and told their parents that the driver wouldn't let her off the bus and that she was really scared and crying. The parents all called my grandparents to let them know about the stories that they were getting. My grandparents never reported the incident to the police or the school, but they did talk to the owner of the bus company, and they never saw that guy driving again. My mom believes that they didn't report it to the police because her dad had threatened the driver's life and would, in turn, report that to the police. My grandfather went to his grave without ever revealing what he said to that bus driver. Several years later, my mom was talking to her mother-in-law about grandma's cousin who was married to a guy from my mom's hometown. She was telling her that this guy was in prison for impregnating his 14-year-old stepdaughter. As an off-the-cuff remark, she mentioned that the guy used to be a school bus driver in the district where my mom went to school. My mom almost passed out at this news. I know what you're probably thinking, and I feel the same way, that they should have said something to the police and had him arrested long before he found another potential victim. I believe they made a mistake in that regard, but I'm glad he ended up in prison though. This happened back in the summer of 2009. I was fresh out of a marriage that I had jumped into too quickly, and here I was looking to find myself again. So I called two of my oldest siblings that live in New York City, and I told them that I was coming for a visit. Needless to say, they were elated. I only had to pay for my bus ticket there. It was rather cheap, and I had a good job at the time, so I was able to purchase on a whim. Gleefully, I packed my suitcase so full it could barely zip, with all my favorite summer clothes, jewelry, makeup, etc. I get to the bus station and all is going well. The lady at the customer service desk hands over my ticket, and I wait for my bus departure to be announced. Along the way on the bus ride, we made a few rest stops until we get to our transfer station in Philly, and this is where things got weird. Everyone transferring buses gets off, and a new group gets on. I see a lot of strange-looking people, but none stood out like this one. There was a guy with long, straggly brown hair, thick glasses, and a wild beard. He wasn't bad-smelling or homeless-looking. In fact, he looked quite well put together and smelled of cologne. He just kind of had this creepy serial killer lumberjack vibe about him. Whenever I travel, I always take the window seat. It's my thing. And lo and behold, creepy guy sits right next to me. He starts talking. It was innocent enough. I'm not much of a talker by nature, so I just listen. He talks about his sister's wedding, stating that he had just attended it in Philly and was telling me that he was on his way back to New York City. I nodded and smiled. He then said in the creepiest whisper I've ever heard in my life, "I'm going to kiss you now." And before I could respond, or react for that matter, he planted his lips onto mine and his scruffy beard scratched my face. I yelped in horror and punched him as hard as I could in his arm. He then let out a loud, insane laugh and said that he loved me and he knew that I was the one. I've never seen this man a day in my life, and I didn't know him from a can of paint. I soon realized that this guy was mentally disturbed. Just as I stood up to cross over him and go complain to the driver, a young woman appeared a few seats behind us, profusely apologizing, claiming that he was her cousin and he had a mental disability. She offered to trade seats with me, and I accepted. The whole time, his laughing gets louder and louder, and more disturbing. That was the end of my interaction with them. But the next bus stop, as I was getting off to get snacks, I walked past their seats and saw the two of them making out, whispering and laughing. What the fuck? They were very strange people. I don't know if they were really cousins or not, but I was glad to make it to New York City and see my big brother at the station waiting for me. I ran into his arms, clearly shaken. He asked me what was wrong, but I never told him what exactly happened. Nevertheless, he and my sister tried to comfort me, but I still wouldn't spill it. I have been a frequent flyer ever since this incident occurred. Even thinking about it gives me the creeps. This happened when I was 9. I left school early because my brother and his friend Sally, who were both 7 at the time, had a dance performance later that day. I was with them and Sally's mom and aunt. I did not look like I was with them. My brother is very dark-skinned, and he looked like he could have been Sally's sibling. On the other hand, I'm pasty, almost sickly looking, and we would often get stares when I was with them. So we were sat on the bus. 9-year-old me is in my school uniform, which is a gray knee-length skirt, white shirt, and my red jumper that is tied around my waist. I was sat alone. I had my lunchbox on the seat next to me, and I was minding my own business. About halfway through our 30-minute journey to the theater where my brother was performing, a guy gets on the bus. He was the very stereotypical creeper type, overweight, smelled unclean, baggy, dirty clothes and scruffy facial hair. He made his way up the stairs and stood over the seat next to me. At the time, I didn't realize that there was plenty of other empty seats he could have sat in, so I moved my lunch bag, thinking he needed the seat. He sat very close to me, and I could feel his eyes on me. I was uncomfortable, but being the shy kid I was, I didn't say anything. He sat next to me for a good 10 minutes. Then his demeanor changed. He looked around quickly and moved his hand towards my leg. That's when Sally's mom, who was in the seat behind him, hit him over the head with her umbrella and said, "Stop looking at her legs, you dirty pig." He moved. Looking at him, I don't think he had ever moved that fast in his life. The rest of the journey was okay. I was shaken, but relieved that Sally's mom had seen what he was about to do. As we got off the bus, I looked up at him, and he gave me a menacing smile and winked. I hurried off the bus and pretended it didn't happen. I saw him on that bus every day for the next year, until he just randomly disappeared. A few years down the line, while searching for a news piece on a local website, I came across a mugshot of the exact man, with that same menacing grin. The article explained that he had been caught with child pornography and later admitted to the rape of a 5-year-old girl. My dad is a journalist and a nonfiction writer, but at the time he was a reporter for the Virginian Pilot, based out of Virginia. He was working on a new book titled The Big Roads when this occurred. We often went on road trips for his research needs, and once his proposal for his new book was accepted, we went on a cross-country road trip from Virginia to California and back, on Route 66. Me being 13 at the time, I demanded that he let me bring along a friend, and so, we were 3. The first quarter of our month-long adventure went off without a hitch. We either stayed in motels with the occasional stay at a grand old historic hotel. My dad, being the outdoors man that he is, decided that we should camp about 5 or 6 times throughout the trip. The first night we camped, we were in the middle of literal nowhere. No one for at least 20 miles on either side, in the middle of the Utah desert. When we arrived at our campsite in our rented minivan, my dad wanted to explore a bit because at the bottom of the hill that our campsite was situated on was an old Pony Express stop. My friend decided to stay in the minivan until my dad and I had finished checking out the old Pony Express stop. We were utterly alone, and as a rather jumpy and skittish 13-year-old girl, it became apparent to me that we were isolated to the point that if anything happened, we would be screwed. That's all I could think about as my dad and I walked down the hill to explore. We checked out the old station, and everything seemed to be going smoothly until we were about halfway back up the hill. A large truck that we noticed driving down the old dirt road a few minutes before had turned into the campsite. We were surprised but didn't really think anything of it. Maybe this guy was on an adventure too. The truck parked halfway up the road and a man got out. He had what I think was a hunting rifle and started hunting around the area that my dad and I were in, about 50 feet from our campsite. Of course, this was an absolute no hunting zone, and my dad became a bit concerned because my friend was closer to the stranger than she was to us. He yelled out to the man, saying that there were children around and he couldn't hunt there. As soon as the man turned to face us, I got an overwhelming sense of complete doom. I felt in my entire body that something was not right. The man looked us over, and without saying a word, he aimed his gun at us. My dad does not carry a gun or knife or any kind of weapon. I felt trapped. My dad ushered me behind a large boulder, but he didn't hide. He stood his ground. There was a solid minute of this man aiming his gun at my dad, and my dad standing completely still, staring back. In my mind, I considered all the ways that this could go down. I was absolutely terrified that this guy would shoot my dad, and somehow my friend and I would have to escape or get murdered during this tense minute. The guy lowered his gun, cocked his head to the side, and pointed at my dad using fake gun fingers, and fake shot him. He then got in his truck and drove away. That night, my friend and I slept in the minivan in 90-degree heat because I was positive this guy would come back and murder us all. We had a few other creepy incidents that occurred on that trip, but we ended up fine and safe after all. 2 days after graduating high school, my two best friends and I decided to take a camping trip on a mountain that was frequented by the locals. Although it's by no means in the middle of nowhere, the town that it's located in is a bit smaller and by no means a bustling metropolis. My friends, Brian and Greg, were 2 years older than me and had taken the trip to celebrate their graduation and figured they would introduce me to my college-age years by doing the same thing. We packed up all the necessities: tent, chairs, horrible light beer, the whole 9 yards. It was nearing dusk when we began hiking up to the camping area, which was about 4 miles or so from the base of the mountain. We set up camp and shot the shit, exchanging drunken anecdotes while snacking on the burnt hot dogs that we attempted to cook in the on-site fire pit, and eventually passed out at about 2 a.m. Not long after nodding off, a noise snapped me out of my sleep. I was still pretty intoxicated, but I could make out what sounded like music coming from outside the tent. I assumed that it was Greg or Brian's phone going off, and I tried to ignore the sound. Rolling over, it was at this point that I realized I no longer had my blanket or pillow in the tent with me. And upon opening my eyes, I realized that this was not in fact a tent that we had set up at all. It was just a tarp which had been fashioned into a makeshift lean-to. My buzz was instantly replaced with a full-blown panic as I broke out into a cold sweat. I peered out of the lean-to and saw what the actual cause of the music was. A cassette player was sitting in the grass about 10 feet away from the tarp and was playing what sounded like a homemade recording of a little girl singing. The only other defining feature at this campsite was the clothesline. One end was fixed to a tree, the other on the ground, and there were 3 white dresses hanging from it, swaying slightly in the breeze. The whole thing was unsettling as fuck, to say the least. I was still trying to make sense of what was going on when I heard walking in the forest about 50 yards away. I froze, not wanting to believe what I was experiencing, hoping that when I opened my eyes, I would be back at the tent. No such luck. The rustling slowly got closer and closer. The tape abruptly clicked as it came to an end, and the rustling became what sounded like a full-blown sprint. I tore off down the mountain, stumbling a few times and ripping open my knee on the gravelly trail. I didn't even realize it or feel the pain until the next day. I was so full of adrenaline. I don't know how the fuck I managed to make it back to the base of the mountain where we had parked. I locked myself in my car and waited until morning. I guess I managed to fall back asleep because I was awoken by Greg tapping on my driver's side window. He and Brian gave me shit about how I was such a pussy for not being able to stick it out the whole night on the mountain. I let them rag on me because I figured it would be easier than trying to explain the truth to them, and I didn't want to revisit it myself. It wasn't until a couple of weeks later that I dared to ask the question that had been nagging at me. I couldn't help but how they figured I would be back at the car. I asked Brian when we were hanging out and playing video games a couple of nights later, and he told me that they had got my note, and then just assumed that I had gotten scared and went back to the car. I asked him what note he was referring to, as I definitely had no recollection of leaving one. He swore I did, and said that he still had it in his camping bag. After rummaging around a few minutes, he produced a scrap of paper that simply said, "Out walking." I slowly nodded and said that I guess I must have sleep-wrote it. He laughed as he crumbled it up and tossed it into the garbage can. It's been 3 years since that night, and I can't explain the events of that camping trip, but I do know one thing. That note wasn't in my handwriting. This happened to my parents in the late 1980s. They were in their mid-20s. My parents decided to go camping in California. When they got there, it was kind of late. My mom was sitting down on a log and my dad was unpacking the truck. While sitting down, she heard walking around the campsite. So she quietly told my dad that she heard someone walking around. They both decided to leave, just in case. They drove about 3 miles down the road with their headlights off, so they wouldn't be followed. Once they got to the new site, they set up camp and began to drink their asses off while listening to a boxing match on the radio. Eventually, they settled in for the night. Now, they don't know for sure that this next event is connected to the first, but they believe it is. My dad fell asleep before my mom did. My mother was in that state where you're half awake, half asleep. Suddenly, she heard footsteps outside the tent. She abruptly snapped back into consciousness and listened. She then tried waking my dad, but he was way too out of it. She listened for what seemed like hours, when suddenly she hears, in the creepiest voice you could ever imagine,
"Here I am. I'm going to kill you."
While the man was saying this, he ran what she believed to be a knife along the tent. She could hear him walking and dragging the knife. She was literally frozen. She couldn't say anything or move. She just sat there with her mouth agape. She finally snapped out of it and screamed, "Jim, grab the shotgun and kill that son of a bitch." With that, my dad finally awoke. They heard the snapping of twigs and footsteps and heard the guy running away. Of course, my parents didn't have a shotgun. It was a huge bluff that actually worked. My dad got up seconds later and began to run after him, but the person was long gone. After that, my parents decided that they were going to get the fuck out of there before anything else happened. When they saw that their tires were slashed, they were in the middle of nowhere and no way out, with some maniac out there that wanted to kill them. They tried blowing up their tires with one of those devices used to blow up rafts. Obviously that didn't work, but they had to try. About an hour or so later, a ranger that was patrolling the area came along and helped them out. He brought them back into town so they could get their tires fixed. While talking to the ranger, they found out that he had been searching for any suspicious activity due to some recent murders nearby. My parents were extremely lucky to make it out of that, because they were most likely the killer's next victims. So I would consider camping my passion. It's the only hobby I have that I take so much interest in and I get really excited to do. More specifically, camping alone. Of course, I camp with friends every once in a while, but nothing matches the experience of camping out in the wild, alone. There's something about sitting by a fire you made yourself until late and going to bed with nothing but the sounds of the wild to accompany you. Of course, camping alone also means I experience some pretty scary shit. Usually it's animals, howls and cries from the woods that send chills down your spine, or animals that take interest in your tent. I had bears sniff and bat at my tent, which is absolutely terrifying and usually keeps me up the rest of the night. I make sure I don't keep any food in my tent though, so no animals should ever really want to go into my tent. The scariest thing to encounter out in the wild, however, is another person. You would think that animal and human footprints sound relatively similar, but they don't. I've only had it happen twice now. The first time, it was just passing footsteps in the grass. They didn't do anything, but it still scared me shitless. The second time, someone stopped and waited for a while. They sounded about 20 feet from my tent. I was holding my breath until they just walked off again. However, about a month ago, I had my scariest experience. It was probably about 2 a.m. I had been lying in my sleeping bag for about an hour, just listening to the sounds of the wild, when I heard footsteps approaching. I remember how they sounded as they brushed through the grass. They kept getting closer and closer, and at this point I was pretty freaked. It sounded like they were directly approaching my tent, and that they were. They stopped right in front of the entrance of my tent. I was trying my hardest to keep my breathing quiet. I always take a handgun with me when I go camping, just to stay safe from animals. That was the first thing that came to my mind when they stopped in front of my tent. I needed that gun. As quietly as I could, I reached into my open backpack, feeling around softly through the clothing and such. I finally found the gun and pulled it out carefully. I held it tightly, staring at my tent door. What happened next really made me panic. The person outside my tent started to unzip my tent door. It was slow, like they were trying to be quiet. At this point, I was thinking, no more assumptions. You need to make sure you don't get murdered. I flipped the safety off on my gun. The person stopped unzipping my tent. After that click, I then choked out the words, "Who's there? I have a gun." After that, the person ran off faster than I had ever heard anyone run. I couldn't shut my eyes after that. I was shaking. I thought for sure I was either going to be killed or kill someone that night. I still go camping alone to this day. The scariness is honestly the best part about it. You never know what you're going to encounter. I shall preface this following story with some relevant information. Some countries have an uncommon yet terrifying kidnapping problem, but instead of asking for ransom, the perpetrators murder their victims and harvest them for their organs in order to sell them on the black market. The buyers are typically wealthy, sickly people who would otherwise be unable to find donors. Back in the late 90s, I was around 10 years old and living in Moscow, Russia. One afternoon, I was in my grandmother's room watching the news on the television. It's not that I was watching the news to stay informed, it's that there was really nothing else to watch, except for some awful Soviet-era shows. The news described a man the police were after. He was wanted for kidnapping children and harvesting their organs. A composite sketch of the man's face was shown. I grew bored, so I telephoned to my friend to go outside and play, and we did. As the sun was beginning to set, we were walking home. The path we took was shadowy, as it was through some trees between a few condominium buildings, with hot water pipes running parallel to the path. Our building was about 60 meters from where the trees cleared and the path ended. We were always cautious about our surroundings when we were outside, especially of other people, so it just came as a habit to look behind ourselves every once in a while. But something was making me really uneasy at the moment, so I looked behind me expecting to see something, and I did. Some man was behind us, maybe around 30 meters. I thought nothing of it and looked to the front again. He seemed familiar for some reason. At that moment, I remembered the composite sketch, and I was immediately gripped by fear. I glanced behind me again, and to my horror, the man was jogging towards us, closing the gap between us. I turned to my friend, but reasoned that if I panicked and just told him to run, he may have thought I was joking, or perhaps I didn't want to arouse the man's suspicion, thinking that if he noticed my intent to run, it would have given him enough time to accelerate to a full sprint. Without hesitation, I muttered to my friend, "Someone is after us. On 3, run to our building." I didn't give him time for a reaction, figuring that if he took it as a joke, then he would just think I was trying to get an early advantage in a race game, which would be ideal. 1, 2, 3. We sprinted, never looking back. I prepared the keys and hoped that I could get open the triple doors in time. The first door we kicked open, as it was the only unlocked one. I unlocked the second door and slammed it shut behind me. I entered the passcode on the next door and stumbled into the building. We immediately laughed uncomfortably since it was both thrilling and scary, much like the times when we ran from a place where we caused mischief, and that's probably what security thought, as the guard didn't believe me. I looked out of the windows and I saw no trace of the man. Could it really have been the same man from the news? I grew up living with my mother and my sister. It was a fairly normal childhood, living in a small town in the UK. I never really knew my dad. All I knew from what my mother told me was that he was a very bad man. I first met him when I was around 10 years old. It was all confusing. I don't really remember everything, but I think they had started seeing each other again. They saw each other on and off for a few months, then he would disappear. This carried on throughout my teens up until I was around 15 years old. He started to get quite aggressive, and she would refuse to see him anymore. My mother never told me when I was younger, but he used to beat her to within an inch of her life when she was pregnant with me. One afternoon he came to the door. When my mom would not let him in, he tried to break the door down, shouting that he was going to burn the house down and kill us all. He didn't know that I was there to witness all of this. I saw him at the front of the house with his hands to his neck, mimicking slitting our throats. The day he got arrested, my mom got a restraining order against him. That was the last time we had heard from him until 3 years ago. I got a postcard with nothing but my name on it and a phone number. I instantly recognized my dad's messy handwriting. I thought it was odd that after 5 years of no contact that I would get a postcard from him. I obviously ignored it. In July of 2013, my mother found the police at our door. They came with some news that was shocking, but also not at all. I'll start from the beginning. My grandmother went to visit my father. She is often traveling around, and it wasn't unusual not to hear from her for some weeks. But when nobody had heard anything from her for 3 months, the family began to worry. The last person who had seen or heard anything from her was my dad. This all happened to be around the same time I received the postcard. Her going missing had coincided with the discovery of a body around a half-mile from where she was seen last. A relative identified her from a digital reconstruction of her skull, which was a striking resemblance of her. My dad was the #1 suspect at this point. He was arrested on suspicion of her murder and later charged. The police took statements, told us that they had found evidence and they knew it was him. My father denied everything. We were following the case, which was when all the grisly details started coming out. They had an argument, and he ended up killing, dismembering, and burying her in a shallow grave. They said that she may have been still alive when he dismembered her. Strangely enough, his family were on his side and said that he was innocent. He later came clean about the whole thing. He said he thought she was a reptile in human skin and wanted to cut her open to see the reptile. He was being held in a secure psychiatric facility, but is currently in prison. He has been assessed by multiple psychiatrists who said he has paranoid schizophrenia. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison for manslaughter, not murder. I find it absolutely appalling. He has served 3 years already, so he will be out in 6 years. Someone who has killed his own mother in cold blood and has made death threats to his own daughter will be out of prison so soon, and it absolutely terrifies me what could possibly happen if he ever finds me or my family. I'm confused about the postcard he sent me around the same time he killed her. I don't understand how the justice system could fuck up so much and let a potentially dangerous person out of prison so soon. I should probably also mention that he is being held in a different country from where I live, although it's very easy to cross the border. He received an extended sentence, so when he is set free, he is not allowed to travel outside the country for a further 9 years. This doesn't mean he wouldn't be able to if he tried. It takes about 4 hours to get to where I am from where he is by train. This story is 100% true. If you don't believe me, you can Google Korstofing Hill murder. So before I begin, perhaps a bit of background information would help you better understand my story. I am now a 20-year-old male living in the Netherlands, and I've been a geek all my life. Games in particular have always played a major role in my life, starting when I got my first PlayStation when I was around 5 years old. Something about gaming just always got me, be it mechanically or in terms of storytelling. I could always find something to love about it. As I grew older, I got more and more into RPGs, and eventually found myself on World of Warcraft. As I got more involved in the game, I started joining raiding guilds. For those of you who don't know, it's basically a group of players who intend on facing the game's hardest content as a team. The second guild I joined was the greatest team of people I had met thus far. One of these people was a Swedish girl who was around my age, named Maggie. We got along quite nicely. As it turned out, her mom, who was also in this guild, was actually living in the Netherlands. So we would often end up in conversations where she asked me to teach her some Dutch, and she would teach me some Swedish in return. It was all in good fun. Fast forward to the beginning of 2013, the aforementioned guild had fallen apart a while back, and I had joined a new one. I stayed in touch with some people in the old guild, but Maggie hadn't really been online all that much. When she did get back online, we quickly caught up. It turned out that she actually moved in with her mother and had spent the last couple of months improving her Dutch and attending high school. She also started dating a guy named William, who was actually part of the same guild I had met Maggie in. He always struck me as a nice guy. Other guild members always thought he was a bit direct, and perhaps a bit rude. But being Dutch, I understood. That's simply how our culture works, so I was always okay with it. June comes around, and me and Maggie recently finished our final exams, and were waiting for the results to come back in. One afternoon, while we were playing online, I suggested a meetup between the two of us. I really didn't have much to do, and given that she had voiced her concerns about finding her footing in Dutch social circles, I figured this would be a nice opportunity to take her first baby steps into the country. She excitedly agreed and asked if she could bring William along as well. Obviously, I said yes, seeing as he was her boyfriend. Meetups are safer when you arrive as a couple, and meeting former guild members was something I looked forward to anyway. A couple of days later, I met them both in Rotterdam, and we had a great day. I showed them around the city since I knew it best. We had some nice conversations, a few laughs, and we ended the day by taking a trip to the Euromast. Before leaving, Maggie had to use the restroom, so me and William were waiting outside. Striking conversation, I said to him, "You two make a nice couple." "Thanks," he replied. "I freaking love her, you know? Honestly, I wouldn't know what to do without her at this stage." Back then, I didn't think much of that statement. It's just a thing that people say when they're in love, so kudos to him, right? Maggie got out of the restroom and we said our goodbyes and parted ways. A few weeks later, we got our exam scores back. I passed high school with flying colors. Maggie wasn't so lucky. She had failed most of her exams. She told me she was going to be studying for the rest of the summer in order to properly prepare herself for the rerun of the last year of high school. I told her if she needed any help, I was willing to see what I could do. Even when I was going to college, she was very thankful and assured me that she would let me know if she needed any help. Fast forward again to September. After our last conversation, Maggie had practically disappeared off the internet. She hadn't logged into World of Warcraft, she was never on Skype, and wasn't even on Facebook anymore. I asked William in mid-August how she was doing, and he assured me that she was fine, so I thought nothing of it. I even admired her focus on her education. However, during my second week in college, all that changed. I got into the metro and picked up a free newspaper in the seat next to me to pass the time. I vividly remember turning the fourth page to read the headline, "Swedish woman 19 from city, stabbed in own backyard." It took me a few seconds to even realize that she lived in the city now, and that she was 19. Even though the article didn't mention a name, I grew very concerned. I quickly sent her a text message, as we had exchanged phone numbers when we met up, asking her if she was okay. The rest of the day went by, and I heard nothing from Maggie. I figured that if something did happen to her, people would have most likely started posting things on her Facebook. Concerned and scared of what I was going to find, I started typing her name in the search bar of Facebook. Sure enough, it was already filling up with messages from people who have heard that she passed away from her injuries. After inquiring with some of the other former guild members, it turned out that William had stabbed her. She had broken up with him after she got her horrendous test results. He wasn't all too pleased with that. In the aftermath of the incident, me and some other Dutch guild members went to her city to meet up with her friends from school. We attended the memorial setup in her school and put flowers at the scene of the crime on behalf of everyone she played the game with. When we met up with Maggie's school friends, we found out that William hadn't been half as nice as we thought he was. During the relationship, he had been very controlling of Maggie, and after the breakup, he began stalking her and sending her threatening text messages. She even went to the police to report it, but they told her that they couldn't do anything about it. After that, she met a different guy and started dating him. William found out, and well, took matters into his own hands. Thinking back on this, the worst part of it just came to mind. When we put flowers at the scene of the crime, we stood around for a few minutes contemplating on whether or not we should go up to the front door and personally give her mother our condolences, given that we all kinda knew her as well. We decided against it, given that we might unintentionally remind her mother that Maggie's online connections ultimately cost her her life. As soon as we got back to our car, we saw Maggie's front door open. Out of the door came her mother with Maggie's younger sister. I knew that Maggie had a younger sister, but I didn't know that she was only 6 or 7. I fucking lost it when I saw her little head hanging down while grabbing a hold of her mother, scared to go around the corner to face all the drawings and flowers people had left there. I found a very recent article that stated that William will most likely be spending 20 years in prison. Honestly, William, I fucking hope you never make it out of there. It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, who's always been interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday. He left them at my apartment. One night, I was bored and decided to try out the goggles at a wooded hiking area / nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a pretty stupid idea since I was all by myself and female. But I was young and stupid, and I got myself all worked up at the prospect of possibly seeing a deer or other woodland critters in their natural nighttime habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked there at night before, and we had never run into anyone else. Our area is mostly rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign that said park closes at 10, and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered down through the canopy of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I found a place to sit down, so I lit my way with the mini mag light on my keychain. A couple of times I thought I heard a little rustling in the woods a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and I put it down to animal activity. Hopefully it was the deer I had come hoping to see. I hiked a fair distance, found a fallen log to sit on, and put on the goggles. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn pitch black darkness into bright as day, and everything appears in shades of green, but quite bright and clear. For a while, I had a blast just looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby, and a big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer though, and I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me, darkness or not, if I continued to sit right out in the open on a log. So I decided to find a place where I could be a little more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods, and finally found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for the deer. I didn't get to see any. What I did see, lit up in bright night vision green after about 10 minutes of waiting, was this man, dressed in head to toe in dark clothing, making his way stealthily through the trees. He was coming from the same direction I had just come from and was clearly trying to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree and glancing around carefully before moving again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice that he was carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, a big one, and he was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. It wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve where hunting of any kind is prohibited. At any rate, this guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter. There was no deer in sight, and very few hunters kill their prey with knives. I was suddenly aware of my horrifying situation. A young woman, alone, weaponless, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 1990s. so no cell phones, and even if I had one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it, lest I draw his attention. I didn't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes had adjusted, and I was terrified that he would look up and see me. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for who or whatever the hell he was stalking. I scanned around, but I couldn't see anyone else, even from my high vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remember the rustling noises I had heard in the woods when I first arrived, and then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I had been a little annoyed and a little freaked out at the time, but when I turned into the nature preserve parking lot and the white car passed me and drove on its way, I didn't think anything more of it. Now I wondered, horrified, if it was the driver of that car, if he had circled back and seen my parked car alone in the lot and decided to come after me. I sat paralyzed in fear and watched the man for what felt like forever, but was probably about half an hour or so. There was a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree, and I was sure he was going to look up and find me, but he didn't. After a while, he seemed to have given up on whatever plan he had in mind, and I heard him say,
"Fuck it."
And he started heading back in the direction he came from, the direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, wet with sweat and crying, until the sun came up a few hours later. Then I climbed down, and still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain, I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and someone had scraped all down the sides of the car with something sharp, presumably a giant knife that I'm lucky didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me, and thank God for big trees with sturdy branches. To answer some questions I've gotten in the comments and direct messages, I did call the police when I got back home. 2 very nice cops came into my apartment and took a report, and that was unfortunately the last I heard of it. I'm a 28-year-old male living in the Deep South. I am now a functional medicated therapy attending paranoid schizophrenic. However, I wasn't always this way, and this story comes from a time before I ever even knew something was wrong. It was about April of 2007 when this happened. I had just come out of a painful divorce, and she had taken all my friends away from me in the process. I was obviously trying to reach out to anyone I could, but I had severe codependency issues that I didn't know how to address. Anyway, I found myself wandering the game section of my local Walmart, as I am still a gamer at heart, and had to see what was available. Things were going alright, and I seemed to be in control of myself. Then he appeared. This poor unsuspecting soul started talking to me about World of Warcraft, which I happened to play. I perked up at this point, thinking that I could make a friend, a new friend that hadn't been taken from me. We made casual jokes and talked about the new expansion. I can't remember if it had just come out or if it was soon to come. At this point, his mother, he was probably about 18 judging by his appearance, came by and took him to another aisle. He didn't say goodbye, he just walked off, and like that, our conversation was through. Well, in my mind, we had made a connection. We had bonded. In my sick, twisted state, I thought he would appreciate it if we hung out for a while. So I followed him. I made it a point to casually stroll down the aisles that he happened to visit and strike up conversations with him about random things. I can't even remember. I could tell he was getting creeped out by the 3rd time I had done this. He started getting this deer-in-the-headlights look every time he saw me, and it was starting to become a horror story. Though in my eyes, it was perfectly natural. At some point, however, his fight or flight must have kicked in, because when I appeared again, as soon as I opened my mouth to speak, he screamed, "Leave me alone!" and stormed off, dragging his mother as quickly as he possibly could. This was a wake-up call for me, that I was being severely creepy and also a stalker. I realized that this could very well be the behavior that caused my divorce in the first place. I checked myself into a mental institution soon after and got the help I needed. I am now significantly better, and my relationships with people have improved greatly. I now have good friends and a loving fiancé. Not all creepers mean to be creepy. Some just need the proper psychiatric help. On behalf of all the unknowing and good-intentioned creepers out there, I humbly and sincerely apologize for our behavior. It doesn't make it forgivable, but I hope it does give some context as to what goes on in the mind of a creeper. I'm a 19-year-old guy who lives in Montreal. About 2 years ago, I was studying at the Ahuntsic College. One day, I had a 4-hour break because of a class that got cancelled, so I decided to go into Montreal and eat at a pretty good restaurant. At the time, I lived in a town that was near Montreal, so I didn't know the city very well. I took the metro and got out in the middle of the city. As I got outside, I saw this weird guy by the side of the door. I thought it was a homeless man asking for money, so I took the other direction on the street. At one point, I took the wrong turn and ended up going the other way. When I realized my mistake, I was on an empty street, so I turned around to go back, and behind me about 50 meters away was the weird guy from the metro. We were about a 10-minute walk away from the station. I passed next to him, and after a minute, I looked behind me and I could see that the guy had turned around and started following me again. So I realized at that point what was going on, and I decided to check and see if he was really following me. So I took about 3 or 4 random turns, and he followed me every time. Now I'm 6'2", but at the time I was 140 pounds, but I had taken a self-defense class, so I knew some tricks to put someone on the ground. After I confirmed that he was in fact following me, I turned on a corner and hid behind a dumpster. When he passed next to it, I grabbed him by the left arm and pushed him up against the wall. I had his arm behind his back. While I did that, I could see a knife falling from the guy's hand. I pushed the knife away with my foot and took out my phone to call the police. While we were waiting for the cops to arrive, I held him in that same position, and he kept begging me to let him go and that it was just a joke. When the cops arrived, they took him away and put him into the cop car, and the guy started crying. When I think about what I did to him, grabbing his arm and putting him up against the wall, I realized that things could have gone a completely different way had I not been so cautious, and that I was very lucky that day. I'm a 19-year-old male. To give some backstory here, this is my mother's story. However, I was with her during this story, but I was only 3. Therefore, I only remember this slightly. I'm going to tell you this story from my mother's point of view. To give you an idea of the layout of our house, the living room has multiple windows that directly look out into the back garden. There is a big gate on our driveway to stop anyone from getting in. Next to the living room is the kitchen, which also has more windows, but also the back door. This will be relevant to the story. Okay, so my mother was completing the household chores as she does every day. I was sitting in the living room watching television on the sofa, with my back to the living room windows. All of a sudden, I saw a figure reflecting off the picture frame hanging on the wall opposite to the window. I asked my mom if my dad was back from work, to which she said no. I'll never forget the look of terror on her face when I told her that yes, he was, and that he was standing in the garden. She looked outside the window and almost had a heart attack when she saw a scruffy-looking but fairly built man outside the living room window. This didn't seem to faze him one bit. He psychotically smiled at my mother through the glass. My mom then asked him what he was doing on our property. He said nothing, with the same sadistic smirk on his face. She said that she was going to call the police, and what he said next was one of the scariest things I've ever heard. He screamed at my mother through the glass that if she even pulled her phone out, he was going to break the glass and kidnap me. My mother was terrified. She wanted to protect me by calling the police, but she also didn't want him to hurt me if she did try to call them. As soon as he saw that she was terrified, he ran for the back door. Luckily, it was locked because my mom has always been a paranoid person, so she always locks the doors. He screamed at her to let him in, or if she didn't, He would find a way in and kill us both. My mother told him to fuck off, which enraged him, and he pulled out a pocket knife and began bashing hard against the windows. I was still oblivious to what was happening, as I just thought it was my dad, only being 3 years old. My mom frantically grabbed me, and I don't mean picked up. She literally grabbed me off the sofa and booked it upstairs. We were backing up in the upstairs hallway, looking for anywhere to hide, when my mom's younger brother popped out of his room with his headphones on. My mom didn't realize that he was home, and he clearly didn't hear the commotion downstairs because of his headphones. My uncle was 25 at the time and was really well built. He intimidated a lot of people. My mom cried and told him that there was a guy trying to break in. While she was telling him this, that creepy lunatic screamed from downstairs that he was inside the house. He then said,
"Boogeyman is coming out to get you,"
which really freaked me out. It freaked me out so much that I actually still remember that to this day. Anyway, since the guy didn't know my uncle was home, he kept screaming and telling us to come out, and that it won't be painful. My uncle told us to lock ourselves in the bathroom and call the police. We did, and after 5 minutes of groaning and blatant violence downstairs, the police stormed in and found the guy bloodied and my uncle on top of him, beating the shit out of him mercilessly. My uncle did not hold back. Turns out the guy was a known pedophile, which is why he was watching me for so long while I was watching TV. After that day, my mom was terrified to be alone at the house. I loved it as a child because I found the running and hiding fun. Obviously because I was only 3. I can never thank my uncle enough for being there at the right time, when my mother clearly forgot that he was still home. It honestly gives me chills wondering what he could have done to me and my mother if my uncle wasn't home. So for some context to this story, my friends and I were all around 14 to 15 years old during this encounter. We also lived abroad in Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic. We all attended an international school, and we were like family. This was 5 people, mind you, a very close-knit group. Our parents generally trusted us to go off on our own in the safer parts of Prague, mainly around our school. This is relevant later on. During the summertime, we would sometimes go out to the theme park instead of our usual haunts. Of course, our parents would often come, along with siblings, so we didn't do this too much. It was too difficult and very little alone time. But now I really understand why they always insisted on staying close and being together. On one of our visits to the theme park in late August, one of our friends, Emma, met a native guy a year older than her. Let's call him Alex. She had the best Czech out of all of us, so she could easily communicate. They seemed to click and exchange phone numbers so they could communicate with each other in the future. Immediately, I got a bad vibe coming from this guy. He certainly didn't look 16, and he had the creeper eyes running all over her body. When we eventually walked back to our parents, I tugged on her arm and suggested that she deleted his phone number because of the creepy aura he seemed to have. I was the shortest out of our group, and my best friends would often protect me the most if we were ever in a bad situation. I was somewhat naive at this time, which really didn't help my case. Emma snorted at my suggestion and told me that I was just being paranoid, though I still had this uneasy feeling. While Emma talked about him while we were waiting in line of one of the rides, Mackenzie, without a doubt the one I was closest with, noticed and asked me what was wrong while we sat together. Explaining my unease about Alex and his flimsy facade of a teenage guy, Mackenzie thankfully took my concerns seriously and helped me voice them to Emma, Chloe, and Camille. Emma and Chloe thought we were being stupid, while Camille was conflicted. In hindsight, they probably thought that the scary stories told about girls being sold into the sex trade were making us paranoid. We didn't get anywhere and eventually had to move on to the next ride. Mackenzie made Camille and I promise to help her keep an eye on Emma, but not to tell her, because then she would get secretive and refuse to tell us anything. We agreed not to tell our parents unless things got out of hand, because God knows the situation was tricky enough without our parents barging in and making it worse. This was the 14-15-year-old mentality talking, which almost cost us. Emma and Alex talked all the time over the phone, and eventually started going on dates. She never told her parents about this, and would often cut lacrosse practice to go see him. This obviously bothered us, but it was impossible to get through that she needed her parents to meet him so she could stop cutting practice and hiding her relationship from them. After a while, Emma was talking about their first kiss, falling deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole. Finally, in mid-October, Emma left us on one of our treks through the mall to meet Alex. Chloe was sick that day, and with no one to stop us, we decided to follow her and see where she was going to meet him. Following around 7 meters behind her, we watched her go to the edges of the city center and to a decrepit coffee shop. Alex and her sat outside and talked, occasionally stopping to sip coffee. They kissed a number of times, but Alex had an extremely eerie look, like he was driven more by lust instead of love. This brought Camille over to our side immediately, as up until this point, both she and Mackenzie are the only ones who hadn't seen Alex yet. We left, then returned to my house to set out a game plan for trying to convince Emma that Alex was a major creeper. Before we could even get started though, Emma called us to tell us about how she thought he was the one. After trying to convince her that she should tell her parents if they were really serious about each other, she blatantly refused and accused us of being jealous. We denied it and apologized, and eventually she hung up after inquiring about our homework for that weekend. At this point, we decided that the situation was dire enough to go to her parents. They seemed to be the only viable option left, but we were still terrified of breaking the friendship we had with Emma and Chloe. With the hope that Emma would still be out on her date with Alex, we dashed over to her home. Thankfully, her mother was home at the time with her younger brother. We quickly told her about what had been going on, and she seemed upset about it. However, we made her promise not to tell Emma that we had tattled. Instead, we proposed that it could have been found out by checking her phone records. Feeling better about having spilled the beans, we all returned to my house and hung out in my room until Mackenzie and Camille had to go home. The next day at school, we were confronted by a furious Emma and Chloe. They probably figured out that we had told on her, and declared that they no longer wanted to be friends with us. I was crushed, but Camille and Mackenzie assured me that they would come around to our viewpoint eventually. I wasn't sure our friendship would ever be the same, but I tried to convince myself that we did the right thing. A couple of weeks later, while Camille was over at my house, I heard the doorbell ring. When I came to the door, it was Emma, Chloe, and Mackenzie. Their eyes looked reddish, like they had been crying. I immediately let them in. All 5 of us sat at my kitchen table, and Mackenzie explained to me what had happened. After Emma's parents intervened, Alex tried to contact Emma in other ways, often leaving a note in her window with a location of where they would meet. Emma and Chloe would organize it so that Emma's parents thought that she was at Chloe's house, while Emma would go out and meet Alex. This happened approximately 3 times in 3 to 4 weeks. On the second meeting, Alex convinced Emma that she should run away with him to his uncle's house in Moldova, a country to the west of Ukraine. On the third, Emma brought a bag full of clothes and such, under the pretense that she was sleeping over at Chloe's. Instead, she rode her bike to the train station and waited for Alex in a cafe near the train platforms. Apparently they had talked for a while, and he gave her a muffin that he had bought on the way there. Emma's father called Chloe's home minutes after she left on her bike to say that she had left her retainers and that he was going to drop them off later. But Chloe's mother told him that Emma wasn't coming over for a sleepover and that nothing had been scheduled. Remember when I said that we were like family? Well, our parents were close too, and they trusted us enough to ask for confirmation from the friend instead of the parents at this point. Thankfully, Emma's dad knew enough to take the car off to the train station to look for her. He apparently saw her bike in the racks outside the train station and dashed to the station looking for her. Before he could even go into the station itself, he saw Alex, along with 2 older men, walking into a gray van, carrying Emma. He ran at them, yelling, and caused a huge scene. They dropped her, ran into the gray van, and drove off. When Emma's father checked on her, it looked like she had been knocked out with sleeping medication. She was taken to the doctor's office to make sure she was all right. The police were called, and the whole thing was investigated. They never managed to track down Alex, But the police officers informed Emma's parents about teenage girls being groomed to be kidnapped and taken to other countries like Siberia or Russia and sold into the sex trade. I listened to all of this with Camille, horrified looks on our faces, and when Mackenzie finished, Emma started crying, while she and Chloe apologized for not listening to us. We hugged it out and stayed at my house for several hours to reconnect. Since then, our friendship has never been stronger, and a strong unspoken policy has been enacted in our school to let the family meet the other half of the relationship. I don't think this experience will ever leave me, even if it didn't happen to me. If you get weird feelings about someone, don't hesitate to follow your gut instinct. I moved to my dad's when I was 10, and I didn't know anyone in the area except for the family my dad was friends with. A single mom with 3 kids. Luckily, there was a girl a couple of years older than me. I was 12 at the time I met her, and we got to know each other a little over the years. We weren't close, but ended up having the same friends. One night, my friend Rob was hanging out with her and her younger brother. They happened to be in the house alone because my friend's mom was at work. Here's where things get terrifying. Her mom had been helping out this one lady through her work, and she got to know her fairly well. She found out that she had a sister who was in a mental asylum, but had been let out recently. The night Rob was hanging out with my friend, they get a knock on the door. My friend thought it was their mom. She knocks a certain way when coming in, and answered it without thinking. Rob wasn't supposed to be there, and took off through the window to his house down the road. He never thought twice about it. It wasn't her mom, it was the sister of the lady her mom was helping, and she figured out through talking to her sister where the family lived and her mom's working schedule. She came in, and this is where I don't know all the details, and I'm glad I don't. My friend's younger brother got away to the neighbors to call the police. The lady brutally murdered my friend a week from Christmas, decapitated her, and left her body naked in a bathtub. I think they found her head in the Christmas presents, but I don't know for sure. I wasn't allowed to go to her funeral. This took place when I was 8 years old, so I apologize if the story and the chronology are a bit spotty. I didn't have an in-depth understanding of all that was going on at that age. My friend and I were walking around, just messing around in the snow, when we ran into a cop who said that something was going down and they were chasing someone, and asked if we had seen anybody. We actually didn't, but we were 8 and wanted to be helpful. So we said, yeah, we did. We saw a girl run down the path right there. We didn't think much of it after that and just continued on. After a while, I got cold, so I parted ways with my friend and went home. I spent the rest of the night watching television in my living room. I woke up in the middle of the night to about 3 or 4 cops in our living room, speaking with my mother and my terrified sister. I asked my mom what was going on, and one of the cops filled me in. Apparently, there was a drug-related incident happening the day prior, where a couple of junkies or dealers were running from the police. The 3 junkies had been coordinating over walkie-talkie in our neighborhood to evade the police. At some point during the night, the woman entered our house. The police sketch actually looked a lot like the junkie lady that crushed her husband's head with an ATM in Breaking Bad. According to my sister, she came down the stairs where she was reading a book, which means that the woman entered through our front door, which leads into our living room where I was. Neither me or my sister noticed her, as we were intent on whatever we were doing. The woman snuck past, changed into my mother's clothes, dumped her drugs in a drawer, and left her clothes in the guest bedroom. She tried to sneak past my sister again, but my sister saw her and freaked out. Of course, the woman grabbed her and tried to silence her and calm her down, telling her that she was just checking out our house and that she knocked, but no one answered and she let herself in. My neighbor, however, saw this woman enter our house and called the police right away. The police arrived at our house to see one of the junkies trying to get into our house through the back door to meet up with her friend, and found my sister being held by the woman already in our house. Why she never left, I have no idea. They arrested them on the spot and searched the rest of the house for anyone else. After telling us this, they took us down to our guest bedroom, where we found all the drugs and her clothes hidden under the bed. I was really curious about any creepy encounters I might have had when I was little. I asked my mom, and she starts explaining this situation to me. I was 5 or 6 when this happened at a local zoo in a small town in Ohio. We were around the big cat exhibits, and I was in love with the cheetahs at the time. And one of the exhibits had about 2 or 3 ocelots that liked going near the fencing around their enclosure. There was a tall wooden fence about my height, and then heavy-duty wire around the enclosure. But then there were holes big enough that I could surprisingly stick my chubby kid hand in. I remember thinking that the ocelots were just baby cheetahs, and I was trying to pet one of them. We started walking around the rest of the zoo. I got cotton candy stuck in my hair and almost pissed myself when we went into the aquarium because I was terrified of sharks, etc. Basically, we were having an awesome time, and kid me was excited about all the animals around. That was until my mom says that she noticed a woman watching us intently. We wound up heading back to the big cat area because I wouldn't shut up about the ocelots. Mom says she got slightly nervous when we were walking back because she thought that the woman had been following us around. Mom had a stress-related mental illness, and I guess she got a little paranoid. But in this case, it was a good thing. This woman comes up to me as I'm watching the ocelots, and I remember thinking that she looked like a movie star because she had blonde hair and bright red lipstick. She says something like, "Come with me, honey. We'll go look for a zookeeper and see about letting you pet those kitties." So I nearly shat my pants at the opportunity. I ignored my stranger danger lessons and took her hand. As I'm walking, I remember getting this feeling that I'm going to disappoint the hell out of my mother because I know going off with a stranger is bad. But ocelots, man. I'm just beginning to get led away when I hear my mom shout. I turn around, and this is where things get hazy. I remember seeing my intimidating, frizzy red-haired giant Amazon of a mother barreling towards me and the blonde lady through a crowd. Mom scoops me up and I wave goodbye to the woman as she stumbles away looking pissed off. And that's where the memory fades out. Mom says she had to physically wrench me from the woman because she kept yelling, "This lady is trying to take my baby." I started crying when the woman tried to lead me away again, and apparently I shouted that she wasn't my mother. Looking back on this, I just feel really emotional about it, and I thank my mother profusely like an ass, because I now realize what a close call it had been. So this is currently happening to me. It's been going on for close to 3 weeks now. I decided to make a profile on Plenty of Fish because I've been single for 8 months now and I've had friends who have had success on there before. I decided, why not? After about a month, I got a message from a pretty attractive girl, and we got along very well. We talked for a few weeks until we decided to exchange our kicks, and that's where everything took a turn for the worse. Within only 4 messages, she revealed to me that her pictures were fake, and proceeded to send me a new picture saying, "This is me, I swear. I'm not fake, I promise." The picture was of a girl I knew looked too good to be true, so being a huge fan of the show Catfish, I decided to reverse image search the picture. Sure enough, I found the real girl. I told her about what I found, so she did it again, sent a new picture. I did the reverse image search again, same thing, not her. At this point, I got fed up and I told her never to talk to me again. She became extremely angry, started calling me every name in the book, telling me that she's a stripper and would pleasure me anytime I wanted and that I lost out. I started getting messages from other accounts on both POF and Kik, claiming that they were her friend or someone who works with her. They talked the same way she did, and I knew deep down they were all her. The friends started sending me messages and threatening me, saying, "I know where you live. Her dad is going to beat the shit out of you." And there was one that made my heart drop. "I know you live in Pine Ridge. That is my neighborhood." This went on every single day. I would get up to 30 kicks a day from her. I never replied. I got so sick of it, I made my Instagram private, deleted Facebook, took down my profile, and made a new kick. About 5 days went by, and then the worst thing happened. I got a message on my new kick. It was a picture from a username called Killer2 Coming For You. When I opened it, I almost pissed myself. It was a picture of my house from across the street. I could see the window to my room with the light on. I called the cops. Long story short, they told me they couldn't do anything because she hasn't physically harmed me yet. Thanks a lot, police. I've been sleeping with a knife under my pillow ever since. Thank God she hasn't done anything yet. But today, only a few hours ago, I got a new message on Kik from a friend of hers. I know it's her, but she just flipped, swearing hardcore. Fuck you. Fuck your dad. Fuck your mom. You're a fucking loser. Me being curious, I decided to sign in my old Kik, and sure enough, 10 new messages. They were all saying how she loved me, but she's now pregnant and has a boyfriend, and how she's still in love with me and wants me to raise the baby with her. Sure enough, she sent me a new picture of a pregnant girl with the caption, "Proof that I'm pregnant." I saved it and did a reverse image search on it. Sure enough, there's thousands of sites with that picture. Every day I'm living in fear, waiting for a new message. I'm going to make a new Kik tonight, but she seems to find them easily. I'll keep you guys updated on this. I'm sorry this is so long, and thank you for sticking with me. Please, wish me luck. Update. The day after I posted this, I deleted my Kik and every other social media but my Facebook, because that's the only way my family can really get a hold of me. I thought I did my best to make sure everything I wrote, liked, or posted was private. Today I got a new message from a person I won't identify, since this is still under investigation. It said,
"My sister loved you, and you broke her heart, and we will come kill you."
That was sent this morning, and I have since called the cops. They are finally starting to take this a little more seriously, as they now have at least a name and a message to go off of. They said they would do their best to get to the bottom of this, so let's hope. Just to clarify, I'm 5'7" and a 14-year-old female. This encounter took place when I was 13. I live in a very quiet village in Scotland, and this town has never had a kidnapping problem before that I know of, so I wasn't exactly prepared for this encounter. My parents asked me to run to the store for some essentials like milk and bread, etc. So I start walking the half-mile or so down to town. Since I am a really paranoid person, I normally keep a good eye out on my surroundings, and I notice something is off. A black minivan is driving slowly behind me. I'm too afraid to turn around to see the driver, but I pick up my walking pace. When I do, they start driving a little faster. In my head, I'm screaming, "I'm gonna die! I'm gonna die!" I finally make it to the store parking lot and practically sprint for the front doors. I probably looked like an idiot, but when you think you're going to die, you run pretty fast. I talked to one of the cashiers, who was a very nice young lady who looked to be in her early 20s. I told her I thought I was being followed and pointed to the vehicle so she could get a good look at the plate number. She said that the staff would look out for me. That made me feel a little bit better, and I made my way to the dairy aisle. I was scanning for the cheapest milk when there was a tap on my shoulder. I turned around to see a 6'2", middle-aged man that had greasy black hair and was wearing a tracksuit. "Hey there, I just wanted to say that you're really beautiful. Very pretty." He took a few steps towards me. I, being a person who really hates human interaction, started to cry silently. The tears were just spilling down my face with no sound. He takes this opportunity to say, "Now, stop crying. I don't want that gorgeous face of yours all wet. You and me should go down and have a drink together. What do you say?" I was so scared at this point, but that's when I heard the cashier's voice coming from behind him, asking him what the hell he was doing. "Oh, well, I'm just asking my beautiful girlfriend if she wants to have a drink at the bar, that's all." I look up to the lady and say, "I'm 13. This is where she threatens to call the police. He backs off and says that this has all been a big misunderstanding and he thought I was older. He then turns and runs out of the store. The lady, whose name was Rachel, helped me gather the rest of my items since I was in a panicked state. She then called the police and told them the guy's license plate number and called my parents to inform them that they should come pick me up. I gave her my mom's number. I brought her a box of chocolates the next day to say thank you. I don't know what happened to the man, but I hope he's in police custody, where he belongs. My husband and I decided to take a mini vacation to a semi-populated region near a casino resort. We both enjoy playing casino games, and we booked an inexpensive motel room at a popular chain a few miles away from the resort. We stayed at the motel for 2 nights. This incident occurred on the second night. We came back from the casino fairly later, around 2:30 a.m., and I parked our car in the same spot as before, next to a red pickup truck. My husband and I got out of the car and noticed a man in the corner room below our room. We were on the second floor. He looked to be older, maybe in his 60s or 70s, and he was peering through the curtains at us. My initial thought was, okay, that's weird. Afterwards, my husband said he made eye contact with the man, and his expression was just vacant, empty of emotion. I passed the creep's room and turned the corner to go upstairs. As I did, I hear this loud barking noise coming from inside the room. All of a sudden, I hear the door open, and a pit bull comes tearing out of the room, barking and growling, heading right towards my husband. My husband later told me that when the door was opened, the guy had the pit bull by the collar. The man looked directly at him, and then released the dog. My husband just backed up and started kicking at the dog, trying to avoid it. The dog did not bite him, it just ran up to him growling and barking, baring its teeth, and then ran to the stairs where I was, and then back over to my husband, and then finally back to the open door. The whole time I was yelling, "What the fuck?" over and over again. Not the most eloquent, I know, but an accurate representation of what I was feeling at the moment. We've been dog owners. We are not people who have bad experiences with dogs. We are not people who are afraid of dogs. But it felt that this dog was in attack mode. I know the stereotypes of pit bulls are not true, and that they can be very sweet and wonderful dogs, so I don't know if the dog had been in the room for too long, or if it has been mistreated or what. But once the dog ran back over to its owner, we bolted up the stairs and into our room. We didn't know what happened, or who the guy was, or why he sent his dog after us. We called the front desk and requested security. They came about 5 minutes later, with the front desk clerk and a police officer. We told them what happened, and they said they talked to a woman downstairs who owned the dog. We were like, woman? No, it was an older guy, not a woman. They told us that they only spoke to a woman. At that point, we were just freaked out, and we didn't feel comfortable staying. Even though they offered to switch our room, the officer escorted us back to our car, and we left, utterly befuddled as to what just happened. We ultimately decided to just drive the 3 hours home. My biggest regret is not asking them what the woman said when they came to the door. We were just so focused on getting out of there that all we really did was tell them what happened and left. I don't know if the old man that we saw was mentally ill or angry at us for some reason. Maybe we woke him up or just wanted to scare some people. But I know that we won't be heading back to that area for a long time. This happened about a year ago. From 2013 to 2015, I worked night shift security at an RV resort. I was on my way to work one night when my front driver's side tire blew out on a long, narrow dirt road. It was around 10:30 p.m., so it was pretty dark. I live in a very secluded area in upstate Florida, and this road was not near any neighborhoods and only had a few streetlights. My shift started at 11. So I called the manager and told her that I might be a little late because I had to change the tire. After I got that squared away, I pulled out my car jack and started to position it underneath my Ranger. I was about to start cranking away when I saw the dim glow of some golf cart headlights approaching me from down the street in the direction I just came from. I was thinking it was probably a local wondering what was going on, and maybe they would be nice enough to give me a hand. The golf cart stopped behind my truck. I stood up from where I was crouching and said, "Hey there, one of my tires just blew out. You wouldn't mind giving me a hand, would you? I'm kinda running late for work." The person on the golf cart did not respond, and then I heard them getting out of the golf cart. The person came within the headlights of their own golf cart. The light was dim, so it was kind of hard to see, but he looked like a middle-aged man with no shirt on, so I could clearly see his beer gut. He also had hairy legs, and I could see that something was dangling under his massive stomach. Turns out, he was completely naked. That's something I could have lived my entire life without seeing. The man seemed to be holding something in his hands. I only caught a quick look at the object. All dick jokes aside, the thing that this guy was holding looked like a machete. The man didn't say a word as he started to slowly walk towards me. I quickly jumped back in my truck, started it up, and noped the fuck out of there. I didn't have time to grab my car jack, so I just left it behind. My truck was lopsided from the deflated tire, and it awkwardly accelerated forward. I could see in my interior mirror that the headlights of the golf cart were close behind me. Despite my truck having a flat tire, it was still going a decent speed, and so was the golf cart that was tailing me. So in a split-second decision, I slammed on the brakes of my Ranger, and not even a second later, I heard and felt the golf cart smash into my rear end. I rolled down my window and shouted, "Fuck you, creep!" I then sped off. I managed to get to work on time. Fucked up my rim pretty bad though. I explained everything to the manager and the cops were called. They searched the road but found no signs of the guy or his golf cart. But they did find my car jack, which was returned to me. Other than a few minor dents, the back of my truck didn't look bad at all. I'm sure that golf cart had it 10 times worse. He had to be going full speed when he crashed into me. Honestly, I'm surprised he was even able to drive away after that. I've come to the conclusion that this weirdo was on a serious meth high. I no longer own that truck or work at that site anymore. So creepy, bare-ass, overweight, machete-wielding psychopath? For the love of God, put on some fucking pants. One rainy night in July, a friend and I were road tripping home from a long vacation. We've been on the road for hours and grew very tired. However, we kept pushing on, consuming supplements such as coffee, and engaged in motivational conversation to pass the time. Her eyes were quickly sinking, and we saw signs in the distance for the next exit. We veered off to an exit for Springfield, Ohio. We instantly began to search for a motel of some sort. Up ahead in the distance, we saw a sign for Night's Inn. If you've never been to a Night's Inn, it's a fairly cheap motel. Minimum breakfast, shady rooms, cheap price per night, but you get what you pay for. My friend and I approached the front desk and requested a room. The owner hardly spoke any English, but after dealing with the language barrier for about 10 minutes, everything was suited and we were set to stay in room 13. As we made our way to our room, we began to grow more and more tired. I slid the key into the door, and after a subtle click, the door unlocked. I pushed my way inside. The room was underwhelming. It had a faint smell of cigarettes and Cheetos. I kid you not, but a room is a room. So after taking a shower, I climbed onto my twin-size bed, and my friend did the same. Within 10 minutes or so, we both dozed off. 5 a.m., I was abruptly awoken by a heavy banging on the door. I glanced over at my friend, who shot up as quickly as I did, trembling in fear. After about 3 minutes of being frozen, I silently crawled over to my phone, avoiding the main window as to not be seen. I dialed 911 and explained the situation. They claimed that they were sending an officer right away. The banging was still going on, so I screamed, "What do you want?" It instantly stopped. I heard muffled voices from the other side of the door as they began to fade away. At this point, it was around 5:30 a.m., still dark outside. I made my way to the door and took a look through the peephole, and there was nothing there. As soon as I slipped back down, a loud banging echoed through the room as somebody began to pound on the window. A deep voice was heard laughing. As soon as it began, it stopped again. The cops never showed up. Right when daylight beamed through the window, we booked it to the car and drove off. This, however, was not the most unsettling part. The next day, as soon as I got home, which is maybe another hour or so away, I began to watch the news. A 40-year-old man was found at the Knights Inn Motel in room 14, which was right next to the room that we were staying in. He had many weapons with him, and also kidnapped a 14-year-old girl who claimed that she was in love with him. To this day, I'm not sure who was banging on my door that morning, but I'm so thankful I did not answer it.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
When I was younger, I used to live in an apartment complex in a really bad part of town. My parents used to let me play in front of our door as long as somebody was watching, which was usually my mom. Things were fine until about a year later. A young man whom my parents thought was a shady character would frequent the apartments to hang out with a few of his buddies, to drink and do drugs, specifically heroin. While he would be waiting for them, I would be outside playing. I didn't even notice him, watching me and smiling to himself. Although I didn't remember much about him at the time, I could only describe him as a strong and muscular man, with an ominous vibe about him. Anyways, hour after hour, this man would sit on the steps of our apartment and try and play with me. Being the overprotective mother that she was, my mom would take me back inside and not let me go back out until he left. This kept happening more and more, and finally it died down when my brother was born, and then it got much worse. Now I was 4 and my brother was 1. We were playing while my mom was doing laundry, and I spot the guy hiding in a bush near my neighbor's apartment. It looked like he had something hidden behind his back. We made eye contact, and I kid you not, he gave us the most devilish smile I've ever seen in my life. Instantly I got very uncomfortable and creeped out, so I called out to my mom. She asked me what I wanted, and I told her to the best of my 4-year-old abilities. Immediately she dropped what she was doing, grabbed both of us and took us inside. At first I didn't know why she took us in, but now that I'm older, I'm grateful she did. Later that night, there was a shoutout between him and the neighbors. He had a gun on his person and ended up shooting a member from a rival gang and escaping. Fast forward 9 years later, I came across an article from our local newspaper about a guy who had been sentenced to life without parole for gunning down a rival gang member. The second my mom saw the article, she explained that it was the guy who used to watch me when I was younger. Apparently he was from a local gang and used to be in and out of prison. That alone was enough for me to get my heart pumping. When I was 11, my family of 6 decided to make the move from suburbia to a lovely rural bungalow. I have 3 sisters ages 9, 12, and 18 at the time. We were all excited for the privacy and isolation of our new home. For once in our lives, we would have no neighbors and a large yard to play in. Our home had large picture windows giving us a beautiful view of the farmland around us. My parents dislike curtains because they collect dust, and since there was no neighbors, we all figured, what's the point? The summer there was so much fun. Every morning I would get up and take my dog for a walk around the woods in our backyard. I absolutely adored the feeling of being alone and was enjoying the freedom of all our new space. Fall eventually rolled around and I continued my routine of walking my dog both in the morning and after school. I remember one morning while walking my dog, I began feeling uncomfortable. I was alone in the woods, and there was no one else around, but I still felt as though I was being watched. I had shivers down my back the entire walk, and for an 11-year-old I just felt really strange. My dog was acting weird too. I kept trying to go further into the woods, but she kept trying to pull me back towards our shed. The shed rested at the very back of our yard, on the edge of the woods, where the trees thin out quite a bit. I didn't like how I was feeling, so I picked up my dog and brought her back to the house and went on with my day. Days went by, and I just couldn't seem to shake this feeling of being watched, especially when I was in my bedroom, which had a huge window in it that overlooked our backyard. The view of the woods that I had previously loved was beginning to scare me. I assumed it was just because it was fall and the forest started looking kind of gloomy. I started having nightmares about waking up in the middle of the night and seeing the figure of a man in our backyard. Weird things kept happening around our house. We suddenly noticed that we were eating things like bread a lot quicker. Every morning, half a loaf of bread would be gone, and my parents attributed this to their hungry growing children. One evening, I woke up and heard noises coming from our kitchen, which was down the hall from my bedroom. It sounded like someone had come home, and I assumed it was my oldest sister. The only thing that was strange was that her footsteps sounded a lot heavier than they usually do. The noises stopped very quickly and I was able to fall back asleep. In the morning, my mom asked me and my two sisters, ages 9 and 12, if we woke up last night to make food. We all said no, and then I asked if it was my oldest sister. My mom told me that she stayed at her friend's house last night, and then thought it was probably the dog making the noises. I became terrified, because I knew I heard unfamiliar footsteps. That night, while everyone else was sleeping, it felt like someone was watching me. Eventually, I fell asleep, but woke up around 2:30 a.m. I heard noises in the house again. It was the same footsteps I heard before. I stayed in my bed and felt paralyzed. I rolled over and faced the window, hoping that if someone came in my room, they would think I was asleep. The noises stopped, and I closed my eyes as hard as I could. I told myself that I was just imagining things, and that monsters aren't real. About an hour must have gone by, and I eventually opened my eyes. When I looked out the window, I swear to God, I could see a man standing in our backyard, watching our house. I was terrified enough that I didn't move at all, and eventually fell asleep again. I was so relieved to wake up alive that morning, but I was still terrified of our backyard. I ran into the kitchen to tell my mom what I saw and refused to walk the dog. I'm not sure if she really believed me at the time or thought I was having a night terror, which I did quite often when I was younger. I went to school that morning. Throughout the day, I was very anxious. The last thing I wanted to do was go home. When I did get home, I saw police vehicles surrounding the house. They had the dogs with them and were searching our yard. They told us a man who had broken into another home and had beaten the couple living there was suspected of being on our property. He stole their wallets, photos, and other small items of value. The biggest thing he took was their car, which had been ditched 10 kilometers from our home. While searching our property, they found all the items from the previous break-in, hidden around our yard. They also discovered that he had been hiding in our shed since his previous break-in. They said he had done this at the previous home prior to breaking in. He would spend time watching the house and observing the residents' routine until he knew it well enough to start coming inside the house. They said he had a long history of premeditated violence, including child abuse, and believed he was planning on eventually harming us. In the shed, they found wrappers, empty cans of food, and scraps. They told us he was definitely coming into our house for the food during the night. From the shed, he had a perfect view of our home and could see when we all went to bed. Although they searched our house and property with the dogs, they didn't find him. After that day, I realized if you feel like you're being watched, you probably are. I'm from the UK, and this story took place around 6 years ago when I was 15. It happened to me and my best friend Sabrina. It was exam time. We were stressed, hungry, and wanted to get home following our geography exam. The walk from school to my house took around 15 minutes, and it was along a main road, so we had no creeper issues, until now. As we were approaching the park that has a bus stop outside it, a bus pulled up, like it always does, and people piled out of the doors. Nothing unusual. That was until me and Sabrina noticed this woman getting off the bus. My gut instantly turned, and although she hadn't said a word to us, there was something just off about her. For one, she was dressed in a heavy winter coat and sported leather gloves. My mom had bought some for herself over the winter, so I thought it was just a trend. But then I realized it was June. She reminded me of Myra Henley. Google her if you don't know her. Horrible woman. And I didn't feel comfortable around her at all. So we were walking closer to her in order to get to my house, and she simply stood there staring at me and Sabrina. As I got closer, I noticed she had very heavy eye makeup on, almost smudged, and then she smiled. Oh God, that smile sent shivers down my spine, but we managed to get past her, and I let out a sigh of relief. Something still didn't feel right, so I turned back and she was now facing us again, but standing still and simply watching us walk away. Me and Sabrina broke into a light jog. My house was only 5 minutes away, so I turned back again, and she had disappeared. I remember being terribly confused as the main road was straight, no shops or houses during that small stretch, only the park, which was also empty. However, my house was still in viewing distance, so I told Sabrina to stay at mine for a while because I still couldn't shake off that nagging feeling of something not being quite right. I made us some snacks, then I decided I would look out my grandmother's bedroom window. Her window faces towards the road, which is great if you were looking out for an ice cream truck. But what I saw made my heart sink. It was the same woman from before, only this time she was walking towards my house, and she seemed to be looking for something, or someone. I yelled out to Sabrina to come see what was happening. She couldn't possibly have seen us as we were looking through drawn curtains, thinking it would protect us. She got closer and just stopped at the driveway between mine and my neighbor's house. We were shitting ourselves at this point, peeking over every so often to see if she was gone. What happened next forever haunts me. She turned her head towards my grandmother's window and mimicked the gesture for throat cutting with a smile. I didn't even care that she had seen us at that point. I was so shocked at how unsafe I felt in my own house. I opened the window and screamed at her to go away. Her smile dropped and she shot me the most evil look before turning on her heels and walking away, stopping at the end of the road to look back and mimic her action again. Me and Sabrina were too scared to even move for the next hour until my mom got home. Every noise made us fear for our lives. We told my mom everything, who made us some ice cream sundaes and called my school and the non-emergency number for the police, who thanked her and told her that they would keep an eye out for her. It scares me how she followed us back and how she could have hurt us if she wanted to, as no one was home except for me and Sabrina. I had nightmares about her for a good year or so after the incident, and I never wished to see her again, ever. Back in 2013, I was at university. It was in England and in the countryside, and the uni has lots of accommodations, a few shops, banks, and a great nightlife. It's also surrounded by woodland and a couple of lakes. Some of you may already know where this is. I want to preface this story by saying that during the time I went there had been a few attacks on girls late at night, so the university had installed extra lighting in one area. This incident happened before the extra lighting had been installed. I was aware to keep myself safe, but I also want to state that I was not just drunk, but totally wasted when this incident occurred, so please forgive my lack of sensible decision making. I had been getting drunk with a guy I was seeing at the time. After we were very wasted, we decided to walk back from the lake near the woods. To get back to my accommodation, we had to walk through the main busy part of campus, then through an isolated part, passing through a small field and a wooded area until you get to a path that leads to the accommodation. I never would have walked this at night on my own. As we were walking, I spot this girl, slightly shorter than me, very pretty with blonde hair. I noticed her because of how out of it she looked and the fact that she was walking in an odd way. She was actually walking in the same direction as us and speeds up towards us, then goes right past. A minute later, a guy passes by us too. There was nothing weird about this in itself, because there's obviously going to be students walking back to their rooms after the club closes. But despite being drunk, I just got this odd feeling. I told the guy I was with I had a feeling that we should speed up, and he told me that I was just being dramatic. He would later eat these words. At the time, for some reason, I had the foresight to mentally note what the guy looked like and what he was wearing. He was tall and skinny and had brown short hair and had on one of those studded belts that you never see nowadays. I sped up because, like I said, I had this weird gut feeling. My male companion speeds up with me. We got to the bottom of these concrete stairs, and after that is the wooded area. Just as we turned the corner, my heart sank. I could see the guy walking faster to the girl on the field, clearly drunk. Both me and the guy just froze, I think out of fear of overreacting. The next part nearly made me sick because of how quickly it happened. The guy pounced on the girl and she fell. He then grabbed her and started dragging her by her limp arms to the wooded area near the field. We were about 40 meters away, give or take, in a position where we could see them and they couldn't see us. The guy I was with threw his backpack to the floor and sprinted towards the guy. The guy had obviously noticed him. At this point, I was running towards the scene too. The guy I was with pushed the creep away pretty forcefully. I ran to the girl and helped her up, trying to ask her where she lived and what her name was, etc. She was totally out of it. Please bear in mind, both myself and the guy I was with were drunk. Had I been of sound mind, I would have handled this situation differently than I had and called the police or campus security there and then. The creep proceeded to shout at us and tell us that it was his girlfriend and he was getting her home, and that she was drunk and they had an argument. He assured us that he was getting her home, and the guy I was with believed him and told me that we should leave them alone. Looking back in a sober perspective, I realized that this doesn't explain him trying to drag her into the wooded area. So we let them go ahead, but I tell the guy I'm with, I'm going to follow them. At this point, the guy I was with begins to get annoyed at me. Really annoyed. I guess he was in a rush to get me back to my place and was also totally drunk and not thinking clearly. We were whisper arguing and had only moved slightly, but the guy had made a considerable distance from us with the girl. It was difficult to see them because we were standing in an illuminated area and they were ahead of us in the darkness. I didn't want to go back to my place and knew I had to keep an eye on the girl. Then we saw it again. Brazenly and foolishly, this guy started dragging her towards the woods again. My male companion obviously realized he definitely wasn't her boyfriend and made another sprint towards him. This time the creep sprinted off in the other direction. I got my phone out and called campus security, and we took her back to her building while we waited for them to take over. The next day I had to make a statement in writing. I found out from the lady who was the head of the resident support network the girl was doing fine and her friends were made aware of the situation, and she was being walked to and from places with security on speed dial. Unfortunately, I don't know who the man was and what happened with him. Please be careful when walking home. Always go with a friend, even if you think it's somewhere safe, like university or your own neighborhood. Around about 9 months ago, me and my partner had just bought a new 6-month-old boxer to keep our 3-year-old Labrador company and decided it would be a good idea to take them both for a walk in the countryside. We live close to a large city called Hull in northeast England. We decided to go for a walk in the ruralish area north of the River Humber that ran through to the sea. Upon getting to a village close to a local landmark, a World War II Army fort, we chose to walk close by and through the small patches of forest close to the nature reserve. We walked along a grass bunker toward the forest, and suddenly my partner pointed out 2 young men had began walking up the bank from the woods in a diagonal manner, as if they were trying to cut us off. From close by, I wondered if the young men had attended some sort of World War II reenactment, as they were both wearing camouflage pants and were also covered in head to toe in dust and dirt. I thought nothing of the both of them, as I was sure they would pass us, but as they grew closer, it appeared they were aimingly walking towards us. They were at least 10 feet away when they stopped, and one of them spoke up. The way he spoke still bothers me when I think back on it. He seemed to have a disregard for manners or even trying to make sense. The young man wanted to know where we were planning on walking, and we told him we weren't really sure, and we'd just see where we ended up. The young man looked disappointed by this and suggested that we should take his route, which went through the forest to what he described as a great place to sightsee and sit. While the young man was telling us this, the other boy kept watch on our 2 dogs almost constantly, as if he wanted to make sure they were always in his sight. We didn't have much knowledge of this area and had not seen any other dog walkers, so we took the young man's advice after they pointed to an opening in the woods, and we walked on. The woods blocked out about 30% of the sunlight, and as I looked back, I saw the young men had not walked off, but were watching us walk into the forest. The path looked as though it was man-made, as it seemed to be the only walkable area throughout that forest, About 2 minutes into the track, our Labrador began sniffing behind a bramble bush, which at first we thought nothing of, as both dogs sniff everywhere they can whenever we walk them. However, she began sniffing in one spot in particular and started rolling on the floor. We went over to her and saw that she was sniffing some sort of shattered rubber pig mask with brown and red liquid on it. It looked disgusting, and my partner forced the dog away from it, as it looked as though fleas were crawling all around it. Further into the walk, the woods had turned into a long path of trees and bushes that had become very narrow, but we could see a turn far ahead, and we agreed that if it led nowhere, we would turn back. I walked ahead and was on my phone preparing to take a photo of the woods when I felt several pricks on my neck, chin, and a part of my face. I let out a gasp to alert my partner, and he told me to stand still in a very alarmed way, followed by him carefully removing thin pieces of string away from my face. As it turns out, someone had tied fishing hooks on lines to a tree in the walkway. It's safe to say that we were both terrified, confused, and angry after this point, and hurried back to the car and left to go home. I don't want to sound cliche or anything, but as we drove off, I swear I could see someone through the back mirror peek out into the road. I don't know 100% whether or not the person who laid out the fish hooks were the people we talked to, although it would make sense. Some detail for a good mental image. I live in a massive subdivision that surrounds a bunch of woods, affectionately referred to as the trails. I suppose the people who own it left it untouched in case they wanted to add more streets. Anyway, I live down the street from one of the main entrances that most people use and know of. My friends and I were a resilient bunch who like to go out and have fires, get drunk, and smoke a little, if you know what I mean. So considering we were out there so much, we decided to go build ourselves a little hideout fort where we could party and even camp. We ended up with a good small clearing off of one of the winding paths, where we had set up a good-sized lean-to with some evergreen on top as our roof, and named it Bear Cave. Now for the incident in question. This happened back when I was about 17 or 19 years old. I had just gotten off work and had gone to grab some fast food. My friends had called me earlier letting me know that they were going to meet up at Bear Cave, so after I got home and changed into some warmer clothes, as this was in the late fall to early winter and it had been unusually cold that night, I decided I should go out there as soon as possible and to take my food with me and eat it there. Now it's about 8:30 and the moon was barely visible through the trees, but knowing the trail like the back of my hand, I wasn't too worried and assumed they would already be there and have a fire started. As I approached, I walked up to our hidden entrance and saw that there was no fire and heard no sounds. I took my phone out and texted someone asking where they were. They replied something along the lines of, "Sorry man, we're gonna be about 15 minutes. Great, I thought to myself. I ducked in and started to scrape together some wood so I could get something started. Unfortunately, everything was wet and without a proper flashlight. This was before they were standard on phones. I couldn't get into the brush and dig anything up. Soon after, I decided I might as well scarf down my 2 burgers I brought with me. Before I knew it, I'd been sitting out there for maybe about 20 minutes, and there was no sign of anyone. I tried giving a couple of my friends a call, and after 5 minutes with no call back, I texted them. Still no response. At this point, I was about fed up and my phone was about to die, so I made a mental note. 10 more minutes, and I'm gone. At this point, I squatted down, holding my knees to my chest, trying to get warm. To my back was our little hut we had built. I thought I heard something behind me. A slight crunch. I looked over my shoulder, and from behind the shelter, I saw what looked like 2 beady eyes glinting from the little moonlight entering through the trees. I quickly and quietly turned my full body to face it. At this point, I felt like I was gonna throw up or shit myself. But keeping my mind about myself, I slowly reached to my right, where I had laid a stick just in case something like this happened. If this was a dog, it was huge. And let me just clarify, this was not a wolf, as I live in the South, and coyotes do not get this big. Something wasn't right. It just stared at me unblinking, as if through me, and made no sound whatsoever. I realized whatever this was wanted to come at me. Thinking fast, I decided my best option was to throw it off guard. I threw the stick, and without turning to see if it made contact, I ran swiftly out of the entrance, expertly placing my feet in all the safe places through the trail, assuring I wouldn't trip, though maintaining max speed. I didn't stop until I saw the streetlights and was safely in the road. About this time, I see my friends pulling up, and all I told them was that I saw something. They didn't seem too interested and proceeded to the entrance. I sternly told them no and suggested that we just go to my house. This seemed suitable to them, and so we went. I still don't know what I saw out there, and it was as though everyone forgot about it. I continued to go back out there, but only at daytime, or if at nighttime, I would only go out there with a friend. But I will never forget those unwavering eyes. A couple of summers ago, my girlfriend and I were camping in the Chequamegon National Forest in northern Wisconsin, and after our experience, we do not plan to return unless we go with a large group of people. My girlfriend and I are from Chicago, so northern Wisconsin was our go-to place for R&R. We've done a number of hiking trips in northern Wisconsin, but never to this area. We are not backpacking experts, but we've been to a number of national forests and have been hiking and exploring when we can find the time away from work. We love getting away from people and relaxing in nature, but this trip made us appreciate the presence of other people around us in unfamiliar places. Our plan was to hike a remote section of the North Country Trail. The North Country Trail is a scenic route, like the Appalachian, but it gets much less used. In some parts of northern Wisconsin, the trail is very remote, and the only access is through logging roads. We plan to hike 15 miles along the trail to a backpack shelter, spend the night, and walk back to the car the following day. We spent the night at a friend's house in Wausau, and we set out early the next day to the trailhead. As we entered the national forest boundary, we were captivated by the beauty of the thick green forest. I drove slowly along the gravel logging roads as we made our way to our parking spot. While we were driving to the trailhead, we passed a couple of people standing next to a parked truck on the side of the road. They appeared to be hillbillies, as they had a rusted-out, banged-up pickup truck, complete with Confederate bumper stickers. As we drove past, I waved, and they stared back without returning the greeting. Friendly people, I thought to myself. After we passed them, I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed they were still staring at us. And before we rounded a bend, I glanced back into the mirror again and saw them watching us through the haze of road dust. My girlfriend and I joked about it, but we didn't think anything of the encounter. Aside from those people, we did not encounter anyone else on the remote logging roads within the national forest boundary. We found a trailhead about 15 minutes later. After winding our way on the narrow logging road, there was no one else parked at the trailhead. A perfect chance to get some needed solitude, fresh air, and relaxation. After parking and making sure our car was locked, we hoisted on our packs and set off on the trail. The weather was relatively cool, which thankfully kept the mosquitoes and biting flies at bay. We took pictures along the way, and we marveled at the lushness of the forest and the topography of the glacial moraine. After a solid 8 hours of hiking, we found our campsite. It consisted of a wooden backpack shelter and a fire ring. Even though the shelter provided ample space for us, we opted to set up our tent about 100 feet behind the shelter. We built a fire at the shelter fire ring, and I boiled water for our dehydrated trail food. As we ate, we watched the sky slowly turn dark. We settled into our tent and looked through the pictures we took that day. But after lugging a heavy backpack for 15 miles and drinking some wine, I was ready for some shut-eye. When we camped at state and national parks, I usually wore earplugs, but that night there were no RVs or other campers to make noise. So I closed my eyes and let the noise of the forest lull me into sleep. My girlfriend was very uneasy that night, but she normally had some apprehension whenever we were sleeping away from home. I'm not sure when we drifted off to sleep, but we awoke to a bone-chilling noise. It was pitch black outside, and over the insects in the forest, I heard a dull thud. It sounded like someone was hitting two logs together. My girlfriend and I were wide awake at this point, and we lay silently in our tent, hearing the noise again. The backpacking tent that we were using had no windows. We could only guess what was making the noise outside our tent. We initially thought an animal got at our food and garbage bag, which we left in the shelter, but the noise was too distinct, and it did not sound like rustling through our food wrappers or camp equipment. Our hearts were pounding as we heard the persistent knock in the darkness. Unarmed and scared shitless, we did not know what to do. I would normally have carried a can of bear spray, but I decided to leave it at home and save the weight against the wishes of my girlfriend. The knocking continued, but we remained still as to not give away our location. For all we knew, whatever was making the noise had already spotted our tent. After what seemed like an eternity, the knocking sound ceased. We lay in complete silence with only the dull buzz of the insects in the background. Then we heard it. Leaves rustling, a branch breaking. Voices. We heard low talking in the distance. We could not make out what was being said, but it sounded like a couple of people were talking. The voices continued for a bit, but to our relief, the voices did not seem to be getting louder. Whoever it was did not spot the tent or decided to leave us alone. We sat in our tent for the rest of the night, adrenaline surging through our veins. At first light, we slowly got out of the tent. I looked around in all directions to see if anyone was out there, but I only saw the forest and the backpack shelter. We quickly rolled up our sleeping bags and camp pads and put our tent away. When we got to the shelter, my girlfriend screamed in horror. On the entrance to the shelter, the wood was freshly cut. The word "kill" was cut into the shelter wall, and there were a number of axe and knife cuts where someone was chopping at the wall. I looked at the ground and saw a scattering of fresh wood splinters. After grabbing our food supply and garbage bag, we got the hell out of there. We were nearly jogging with our gear as we made our way back to the car. I kept glancing back over my shoulder and gazing out through the woods to see if anyone was following us. We traversed the glacial eskers that we saw the day before, and we knew we were getting close to our car. We were quietly rejoicing as we neared the trailhead. We made it back to the trailhead in near record time, but something was wrong. The windshield wiper on my car was sticking straight up, and there was something stuck to the wiper. As we inched closer to the car, I saw there was blood smeared on the windshield, and a squirrel carcass was impaled on the wiper blade. Hair and blood was still stuck to the wiper and on the hood of the car. I didn't bother cleaning off the car. We threw our gear in the trunk and sped off without removing the animal from the wiper blade. As I sped down the gravel logging road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but I could not see anything through the cloud of road dust behind the car. When we got to the gas station by the nearest town, I removed the carcass with a wad of newspaper, and I tried to remove as much dried blood as I could. I filled up on gas, and we didn't stop until we made it back to Milwaukee. This was the last trip I took to the woods of northern Wisconsin. My mom told me a story not too long ago that really made me freak out. Well, let me start off by saying that I've been trying to find something to back up her story on the net, but I can't find anything as this happened in 1986. My mom and dad lived in Winfield, Louisiana, way out in the woods. It was 20 miles away from any real civilization. They lived in a trailer on a ton of land they were trying to sell, so they could move to Shreveport. The reason being is that my mom was pregnant with me, and they wanted me to be able to have a relationship with my grandparents, so this is where we begin. One day while my dad was at work, my mom was home alone with her white German Shepherd, Sheba. She was doing something in the kitchen when she heard someone knock on the door. She goes to answer the door, and there was this really tall man standing there. Then Sheba starts barking like crazy and biting at the door, trying to attack the man. According to my mom, she never acted this way before. She pushes Sheba back and asks, "Can I help you?" The man answers,
"Well, I just wanted to stop by and look at your house to see if I wanted to make an offer."
My mom, being somewhat desperate to sell the house, agreed to let him in and look around. Before she let him in, she grabbed Sheba and put her outside so that the man could look around in peace. Sheba became more aggressive and determined to get in the house. She bit and growled at the door. Mom kinda shrugged it off, not really thinking why Sheba was acting so crazy towards the man. So as the man walks in, he glances over the very small living room, barely paying any attention to the house, and looking at my mom with a weird stare and standing really close to her. He then says,
"I need to call my wife about the house. Can I use your phone?"
My mom agrees and told him where it was on the counter. My mom kind of walks off in the kitchen and notices he didn't dial any numbers. He was talking really low on the phone. He says,
"Hey Lucy, yeah, I really like the house. I think you will too. Okay then, I'll talk to you later. Bye, honey."
He then puts the phone down on the hook, but not all the way. He then turns to my mom and says,
"How much do you want for this house?"
Then that's when my mom heard the phone. It was making that noise it makes when you leave it off the hook. She got scared but tried not to show it, and said, "My husband is going to be here in 10 minutes. You could talk to him about that." The man stares at her for a minute. Mom was crying on the inside, but she never acted like she was scared, and she stood her ground. He then says,
"I better go."
Then goes towards the door. The door opens. Sheba jumps on him and attacks the man's legs. He runs to his truck, Sheba at his heels. And without saying another word to my mom, he left. After he was gone, Mom freaked out and called my dad. A few days later, she was reading the newspaper and saw a police drawing of a man that was wanted for murdering women that were home alone, using the excuse he wanted to buy their homes, earning him the title, the real estate killer. It was the man that came to the house. My mom freaked out. The mystery was solved. Sheba was acting that way because he was going to hurt my mom, and he left the phone off the hook so she couldn't call for help, I assume. Needless to say, my mom never showed the house alone again. She thanks God that her and I weren't killed that day. She thinks the reason he didn't do anything is because she didn't show any fear when things were getting strange. It's crazy to think I may have never been born because of some murderer. I just discovered this sub recently, so first time poster here. I'm using a throwaway account because some of my friends know of my main one, and I haven't shared this story with many people, mostly out of avoidance of judgment, because I know I didn't make the best choices here. Being a 26-year-old woman who enjoys her independence and goes out a lot alone, I don't have a shortage of these stories unfortunately. But this happened about a month ago and it's still fresh in my mind. I work for a national nonprofit organization and work remotely from my home in Michigan, but I am sometimes asked to travel. In early July, I had to fly to DC for a series of meetings with about 10 other staff members, who were all out-of-towners and would be staying at the same hotel. I was on the plane and I realized I forgot my cigarettes at home, and by the time I landed in Washington, hopped in a taxi to the hotel and threw my bags in the room, I was jonesing super hard. It was already late by then, almost 11 o'clock at night, and despite my better judgment, I looked on my phone for the nearest Walgreens so I could pick up a couple of packs for the week. I decided it was too late to call one of my work friends who I knew was already in the hotel to walk with me. And while I consider myself a fairly cautious person and wouldn't normally go exploring an unknown neighborhood alone in the middle of the night, my nicotine craving won out. I headed out for the nearest drugstore, or at least the nearest my phone picked up on, which was about 10 blocks away. While the hotel was situated on a busy, well-traveled street with lots of bars and restaurants, I pretty quickly realized the turn I had to take to the store put most of my trip on a much more secluded, darker stretch. I also realized just how long 10 blocks actually was. Lots of boarded up shops and homeless people line the neighborhood. I always make it a point to carry some extra cash on me when I'm in the city to give to folks who need it. I blew through that pretty quickly. I could feel occasional eyes on me as I passed by, and someone yelled something from across the street, just some standard innocuous, "Hey, how's it going" shit. All that being said, the trip there was uneventful. After getting out of the store, I immediately paused out front to light up, when a guy who was standing along the side of the store building, the store was right up against an alley, called me over. He was standing maybe about 7 feet away, leaning just inside the entrance to the alleyway. I ignored the first couple of "heys" and started to turn to head back to my hotel in the opposite direction. But he let out a really aggressive, "Bitch, I'm talking to you," which made me jump and instinctively whip my head around. Mistake number one. Just looking in his direction was an invitation for further interaction. His voice calmed. He asked me for a cigarette, and still taken aback, I shuffled over to him in this alley where I really couldn't get a good look at him at first. I handed him a cigarette and my lighter. He asked me what a little girl like me was doing out all alone. I stammered something. Then he asked me if I wanted to go party. I told him no, and that I needed to be heading back now. I remember not wanting to tell him where back was, because I didn't want to reveal that I was from out of town and completely unfamiliar with the area. After a minute or two of this, he grabbed my arm around my elbow, while he kept insisting how fun it would be. I tried to slide my arm out of his grip, not super aggressively, but just enough to signify that I was not about this. But he tightened his grip. What he was doing wasn't overtly aggressive either. It was just like he was trying really hard to convince me, but then he put his other hand on my back and just held it there and told me he lived just a couple of blocks down the street and he would show me a really good time. We could smoke, put on music, whatever. Without removing either hand, he started to lead me out of the alley entrance and down the street in the opposite direction I had just come from. By now, I was totally flipping shit internally, and even though I was trying my best not to let it show, my voice was quivering a bit when I asked him to please take his hands off me, and that I needed to get home. Without removing either hand, he just laughed and kept me moving. His laugh was disgusting. I was scanning the street for someone to try to flag down for help, but I didn't see anyone up ahead. He just kept muttering, now more to himself than to me, about what a good time we were going to have, and how I was such a cute little girl. After about half a block, when his hand slid a bit lower, I finally snapped out of my trance and started to struggle. I now yelled at him to let me go, and tried to push him off of me. He resisted me, and tried to pull me into the shadows of the storefront we were standing in front of, out of the way of the streetlights, and kept telling me, now angrily, but not yelling, to be a good girl. In the midst of this, he had me held tight. He then pulled my body against his. This felt like an eternity, but couldn't have been more than a couple of seconds, before I was able to somehow push him, elbow him, knee him, whatever I could do, and break free. As soon as I was out of his grasp, I started to bolt back in the opposite direction, and I heard him yelling out all sorts of colorful names behind me. I didn't look back for what felt like forever, and when I finally did, I was relieved to see that he wasn't following me. That didn't stop me from running another few blocks until I was completely out of breath and near hysterical. I called one of my coworkers and could barely get the story out between my sobs, and he was insistent upon me going to the nearest open store, which was a McDonald's, and wait for him to meet me there. I sat away from the windows but kept my eyes locked on the door as best I could from where I was sitting, terrified that the creep had somehow seen me walk in. The person I called and another male coworker were there in less than 10 minutes. I work with some seriously awesome people, and they walked me all the way back to my hotel room door. I was still completely rattled, and so they called yet another coworker to get in on my drama, and she came and spent the night in my room with me. All three of them insisted I call the police, but I just didn't want to deal with it. I just wanted to put it behind me and get on with the rest of the week. Honestly though, a month later, and it's still not entirely behind me, and I can't help to think about the next close call that could always be right around the corner. Fuck that guy for making me feel so entirely unsafe and insecure. So this story happened back when I was in 5th grade in 2005, when I lived in western Montana. My bedroom was shared with my 2nd grade sister, and we had a king-size bed that we both slept on. To describe our house a bit, our room was facing the backyard, but was a basement room. Basically standing up looking out the window in my room, I was eye level with the ground outside. Up and to the left above my window, I could see onto our deck, which looked into our upstairs kitchen. Kind of confusing, but bear with me. Anyways, this particular night, my sister and I were having a sleepover, and our friend was in the bed with us. When we were falling asleep around 1 a.m., our friend woke us up to show us that a deer was on our deck. We looked out, and we all saw a deer on the deck. This was normal in Montana, so we laid back down. I guess my friend stayed up and stared at it. She woke us up 5 minutes later, saying that she actually thought it was a person. Right then, we all looked at it, and we saw the shadow move a little. It was clearly a tall person's silhouette. We all started freaking out, and then we saw 2 green laser lights. They were just 2 small pinpoint lights that were coming from the guy's head area. We all thought it was binoculars. At this point, we were on high alert, and our eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and we saw it was clearly a guy looking into our kitchen window. I was too scared to go tell my parents all the way upstairs and past the view of the guy looking in the window. So we used my friend's cell phone and called the house phone. Neither me or my sister owned cell phones at the time. The phone rang loudly, and we watched the guy run full speed off the deck. As soon as he ran away, the 3 of us ran screaming upstairs and told my dad. He called the cops and they searched the streets, but they never found the guy. Now here's where things get weird. So just 2 weeks earlier, the town's police station sent around notices in our neighborhood telling us that a person of interest and dangerous sexual predator who had a warrant out for his arrest had been spotted in our area. A tip had said he was staying with a family member 3 streets down from us. I remember this because I remember my mom, who was a bit paranoid, drove us by the address of the house and made us very aware of what was going on and would not let us ride our bikes outside during this time. I remember looking at the house every time we drove by it. Turns out, 2 or 3 months later, this same man was apprehended for the kidnappings, abuse, and murders of 2 children and killing their families in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, only 2 hours away from my house. In some of his interrogations, he confessed to stalking the kids by watching their homes at night with night vision goggles. I also found some obscure website that had some of his writings where he discussed living in Montana and talked about how right before killing this family, he was searching for children to kidnap. We were around the same ages as the kids who were taken by him. I have no proof that he was the person looking into our window that night, but the evidence all adds up for me, down to the timeline and the area I lived at the time. I don't want to go into too much detail of his crimes. They were all over the news, and you can read about them in various articles online. I researched this guy in depth, and he was a sick motherfucker. He allegedly has encrypted diaries of his crimes and filmed the tortures he committed, so I consider myself blessed. Hopefully he stays locked up, so I never have to meet him. So I recently started school again, and as part of my daily routine, I'm required to travel to Toronto Monday to Friday via train and subway lines. It's about a good 2 hours one way. So I usually pull out a good book, pop in my headphones, and relax to some light music. I, of course, being from out of town, have heard a lot of the horror stories that many people have experienced on public transportation. Naturally, I thought most of it was just over-exaggeration and tall tales. However, I was very quickly proven dead wrong. Rewind to about a week ago. I had just finished a very long, grueling day of school, 5 a.m. to 7 p.m., and I wanted nothing more than to just relax and get home as soon as possible. I took my usual bus route to the subway station and sat down on one of the seats directly next to an exit door. Now, a little context. I am facing forward, looking at the one seat ahead of me across the aisle of the subway car. This seat was occupied by a 20-something Asian lady who was playing some game on her phone and was paying absolutely no attention to anything going on around her. Next to the seat opposite me is another seat facing the Asian lady, and it's this person in this seat that made my 40-minute subway ride very disturbing. Occupying the seat was a lady about 30 to 40 years of age who possessed a very creepy smile. I say this because she never stopped smiling, and I mean she was smiling the entire subway ride. Anyways, the car pulled out of the station, and we were on our way. For the first half of my trip, she would continuously be staring at this Asian girl, laughing and muttering to herself. She would also take her phone out of her purse and started taking pictures of this girl. How the Asian lady did not see this, I still have no clue. About halfway up the tracks, the Asian lady left the car, and this is where the attention was directed to me. She turned towards me and just smiled at me with a huge toothy grin. I knew deep down that if I made eye contact, I was going to be in for a bad time. So I just stared at a poster on the roof of the train for what felt like hours. Eventually, she got the hint that I was avoiding her gaze like the plague and went to plan B. She opened her purse and removed a tube of toothpaste. Colgate was written on the side, and proceeded to ingest roughly half of the tube. I damn near threw up then and there. Somehow, I held it together. My stop came, and I bolted from that car as fast as I could. I got to the escalator and glanced back, and guess who I see fast walking after me, arms at her side, still smiling. I was understandably shitting my pants, terrified by this point. I ran out of that station right to the bus, just as it was pulling out of the station. I took one final look, and there she was, standing on the platform, head cocked to the side, laughing and waving goodbye. So that's the story of how I lost 5 pounds of sweat and ran faster than Usain Bolt. So I recently moved to a big city about 1,000 miles away from my hometown of very few people. Not knowing the area very well, I secured an apartment directly in the worst part of town. I'm a 24-year-old woman, and I'm pretty small, and I've always been wary of people because of a meth problem of where I grew up at. In this new area, there were gunshots about twice a week, every week, meth heads and homeless people wandering around, and all kinds of creeps lurking by the dumpster at night. The police were constantly at my complex for this or that, and would even ask us if it was absolutely necessary to come out when we called about stuff happening. I was on high alert 24/7, and always carried a knife and mace in case shit went down. One bad thing did happen to me while I lived there, and it was nothing that I could have ever dreamed I would experience. So it's 1 a.m., and I was home by myself indulging in some mindless Netflix movies when I hear the most erratic knock on my door. I expect it's the police coming to question me about some more shootings or gang violence like usual. No. I look through the peephole, and there is this crazy-looking, possibly methed-out lady standing there, looking terrified. So fearing that she may either be hurt and need help or try to hurt me, I grabbed my mace, stashed it in my pocket, and I opened the door to where I'm just barely peeking out. This is when I notice she's wearing a fucking hospital gown covered in blood. Just like a real-life horror movie, standing at my step with her crazy eyes, blood everywhere. She mumbles a bit and then asks me for water. So I say, "Sure, I'll be right back," and I lock the door behind me. I'm trying my hardest to stay rational and not freak the fuck out. I have some pretty substantial anxiety issues, so I was well on my way to a panic attack. So at this point, I think she might be really hurt, so I grab a bottle of water and decide to go out and wait with her with my concealed weapons until I can get the police there. I figure if she's really hurt, I can at least make sure she gets medical attention. Well, she obviously noped the fuck out of there, because when I opened the door to look for her, I didn't see her anywhere. What I saw instead was much, much worse. On my front step, where she had been, was a pile of bloody bandages, along with her bloody hospital gown. And on top of all that, there was a bloody fetus. I shit you not, a bloody, dead fetus. I will never be able to get that image out of my head. I've never been so terrified. I thought I was in the goddamn Twilight Zone, or some fucked up Stephen King movie. I called 911 and explained what happened. They knew it was necessary this time, and they were there in 3 minutes flat. They took pictures and cleaned up the step, and had 6 cop cars lining the parking lot, as well as the emergency responders. They filled me in, and apparently this woman was a drug addict, and her drug addict boyfriend tried to beat the pregnancy out of her. She was in the hospital, but I guess she escaped and wandered deliriously around the city and ended up on my doorstep. They had been looking for her after the emergency room called with a code yellow. I honestly felt so bad for her. She was probably harmless and didn't deserve what happened to her. I have no idea what happened to her after that, and I got the fuck out of that place the second my lease was up. My brother met his girlfriend a year ago when he was 17 and she was 16. For a while, they seemed like they had a great relationship. My brother Alan and Jamie were always happy together, and Jamie made a real effort to get to know the rest of the family. However, I noticed that something was off whenever my brother wanted to go out with his friends without Jamie, and she would have a complete meltdown, screaming about how he didn't love her and how much he does for him, etc. This happened all the time, so eventually he started spending more and more time with her to avoid conflict. She even got annoyed at my mother's funeral because he wasn't paying enough attention to her. Okay, so what the fuck? Our mom just died. Chill out. Things started to get worse when she started accusing him of hitting her whenever he would try to deflect her from punching him in the face. My brother has some mild anxiety problems and was pretty messed up about our mother's death since they weren't on the best of terms before she died. He uses Xanax to try to self-medicate, which she knows, and would often pick fights with him to use his actions against him later on, or try to tell the school that he was on something to get him in trouble when he no longer wanted anything to do with her. Eventually, Alan couldn't take it anymore and ended the relationship a few days ago. A quick side note, our back sliding glass door is pretty weak. If you yank hard enough, you can force it open, despite it being locked unless we put the key in. The other day she showed up at 5 in the morning, banging on the door and demanding to be let in. My dad got after her and she left. This morning, however, she broke in through the back door and got into bed with my brother, who slept through all of this. My dad found her and told her to leave, or he would call the police. This afternoon, I heard my brother and his friend get back from school. All was well once again until Jamie broke through the back door, as she had taken the key this morning. Alan's friend stopped her from going into his room, and I told her to leave and not come back, or I was going to call the police. After she had left, my dad came back with 3 new keys made for the back door. My brother showed us her claims of her cutting herself, which we did a reverse image search and immediately found them, along with the fact that we didn't see any cuts on her arms. It's gotten so bad that my brother does not want to go to school since she follows him around and tries to get him to talk to her. And when that doesn't happen, she tries to get him into trouble. Jamie, I hope you get out of our lives and get the help you so desperately need. This story takes place 4 years ago and requires some history. I grew up pretty much as an only child in northern Michigan. I have an older sister who is 11 years older than me, who moved off to college as soon as possible. Because of this, I was extremely close to my parents. To this day, we're still best friends. One thing we all truly enjoyed was video games. When I was younger, I would sit and watch my father play Lara Croft on his computer for hours. I absolutely loved it. When I was 9, my parents introduced me to an MMO called EverQuest. We started off as casual players, but through the years and the game's expansions, we quickly advanced. By the time I was 17, I was playing non-stop. It was extremely hard for me to maintain an active social life, and because of this, I never had a boyfriend before. The 3 of us decided to apply to the highest ranked raiding guild on the server we played. That's when I met my ex, and the trouble really began. Within a few weeks, the raid leader had quickly taken a liking to me, and not wanting to upset him, we exchanged MySpaces. Yes, it was that long ago. I've always kept myself in decent shape and would consider myself to be fairly decent looking. He only had 1 picture on his MySpace, however it was extremely dark and blurry. It raised a red flag that I quickly dismissed. From his MySpace, I learned that his name was Kurt, and he was 10 years older than myself, something that he had failed to mention when I was first talking to him. Because of his age, I kept our friendship that was quickly growing into a relationship for my family. We began talking for hours, late at night on the phone. Within 2 months of us meeting, he told me that he loved me, and I was ecstatic to finally have someone. The relationship had always been verbally abusive. If I didn't send him a couple of nude pictures or videos throughout the day, he would lose his mind and tell me how fucking worthless I am. He often reminded me that I wasn't pretty enough or smart enough to find someone else that would love me. And still, I stayed. 3 months after hiding our relationship from my parents, they found out. They did whatever they could do to keep us apart, including taking my phone, deactivating my MySpace page, and threatening to delete my EverQuest subscription. In the end, they inevitably failed, and being the foolish girl I was, I fell more in love with Kurt. Through the next couple of months, my mother had actually begun taking a liking to him. He was extremely charismatic and could fool anyone. He convinced me to move to Tennessee to be with him. Admittedly, I was excited about the idea. In August of 2009, by this time I was 18, I met him for the very first time. My parents were there to help me move into my apartment. They were somewhat wealthy and agreed to pay for the first 3 months' rent, as long as I got a job and finished beauty school as soon as possible. Almost immediately after my parents left to go back home to Michigan, things started going horribly wrong. The very first night I was there, I cried, because it finally hit me. I gave up my entire family and all my friends to be with this man. Seeing my tears upset him, and he began throwing himself at the walls, onto the bed, anything he could hit to try to hurt himself. He would tell me how worthless he felt for making me cry. A week later, I started beauty school located just down the road from my apartment. Everything was seemingly going fine, until I started making friends. I became close to 2 girls, and Kurt absolutely hated this. He would accuse them of trying to break us up and trying to make me cheat on him, even though they hadn't met him and didn't know anything about him. He wrote me up a schedule that I had to follow daily. I could go to beauty school, but I had to be home within 20 minutes of the school closing. I was no longer allowed to go out by myself, and going out to lunch with my 2 friends was strictly forbidden. He also began monitoring my cell phone, and only allowed me to talk to my parents when he was around, ensuring that I couldn't tell him anything without him knowing. A week later, he hit me for the first time. I don't remember what we were arguing about. I've always been more of the quiet type. I remember him punching me in the back of the head and falling. I remember laying on the floor as he screamed at me, kicking me in the stomach, in the legs, everywhere but my face. I heard him grab my cell phone and my car keys and put them in his pocket. I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up and found my cell phone lying next to him. My car keys were nowhere in sight. I grabbed my phone and quickly left the apartment, making sure to make as little noise as possible. Once outside, I called my mom and told her everything that had been happening. My father had been in the hospital the day before for a major surgery, and my mother was already exhausted. She was also hysterical. She told me that she was going to call Kurt's father and tell him to get him the fuck out of my apartment and to remove all of his shit before she called the police. We never did call the police, and I'm still unsure why. Mostly fear on my part, I believe. She told me to go inside and to get my keys and get out of there. Her and my father would be coming down in 2 days to get me and move all my stuff back to Michigan. I waited a few minutes and went inside. Kurt was up talking on the phone with his father. He began screaming and throwing furniture around. He then viciously grabbed me by the hair and asked me how could I do this to him. I quickly brought up my right arm and elbowed him as hard as I could in the nose. I grabbed my purse and keys, which were on the counter. While my back was turned, he grabbed a knife and tried to stab me. I effectively dodged him and kicked his arm hard enough that he dropped the knife and was at the very top of the stairs leading up to our apartment when he grabbed the hood of my sweatshirt and kicked me as hard as he could down the stairs. I was on my feet, ignoring the pain throughout my entire body, and ran as fast as humanly possible. I made my way to my car, only a few feet away, and once inside, I looked back. Kurt was nowhere in sight. I assumed he went back to the apartment to damage my belongings. I quickly sped off and called one of the friends I had made. She was more than willing to offer me a place to stay. 2 days later, my parents showed up. I'm not sure who was in rougher shape, myself or my father, who was still recovering from surgery. I never saw Kurt again, nor have I been back to Tennessee. In hindsight, I definitely should have called the authorities, but I knew the kind of connections that Kurt had, and was worried what would happen if he ever found me or my parents. Before the bashing starts in on my parents, in their defense, they knew very, very little about the situation until it was over. My father was extremely ashamed that I was dating a man that much older than myself, and made it clear several times. I, however, was just too stupid to listen. First off, I want to apologize for any grammar mistakes I make. English is not my native tongue. I'm in foster care, and I recently moved into the basement of a house in a much nicer neighborhood. It was an affluent area, big houses, and not a lot of traffic. My room is in the basement of the house, and my view is into the backyard. There's a motion-activated light, but it only works a quarter of the time. Here's some pictures for a better understanding of the layout and view. Anyways, I'm an insomniac, so I'm always up way later than the couple I live with. It was late at night, around 3 a.m., so it was very dark outside, and I was in my room playing the night away on my guitar. My little lamp was on, and I had the window cracked open. I'm not an anxious guy, but for some reason, I felt like something was off. Like I was being watched. I brushed it off because the motion-activated light hadn't turned on, and I couldn't see anything or anyone in the thick darkness outside. At some point, I stopped playing and went to take a piss. As I came back into my room, I noticed that it was way cooler than when I had left. Again, I brushed it off until I saw my window had been pushed open. There's a security chain on my window that was broken. But in my sleep-depraved idiocy, I just wrote it off as my cat coming inside to eat while I went to go use the bathroom. Before I moved in where I live now, I lived in a seedy high-crime area, so I'm always on hyper alert at night. I went to look just to be safe, and that's when I saw him. There was a person a few meters away from my open window, but I've been in my fair share of fistfights and physical arguments, so I wasn't really worried about him fucking me up. He obviously knew that I had spotted him, as we made eye contact before I sprinted for the window. I got there a little before him, but somehow he managed to get his fingers inside before I slammed the window down on his fingers with all my might. Hearing a horrible cracking sound as the heavy window hit his hand. He didn't try to retract his hand or say anything at first, but when I cracked the window open to do it again, he pulled away. I secured the windows, and he stood there with his bleeding hand held close to his body, with his eyes firmly locked with mine for about 10 seconds or so, before he ran off in the direction of the front of the house. I ran upstairs as quickly as I could, but he was nowhere in sight. I woke up the couple, but not before I checked all the doors and windows, and they called the police while I checked everything again, and turned on the lights in the house. The police took samples of the blood on my window frame, but it didn't match anything in their system. No one went to the hospital in a 100-kilometer radius with matching injuries in the following 5 days. To this day, I don't know who the fuck tried to break in, or if he had intentions worse than that, or if he's still around. The thing that bothers me the most is that he didn't run away when I first spotted him. I don't know how long he had been out there, lurking and spying on me in the darkness. So creepy guy lurking in the night, I hope your hand is severely fucked up. This happened just last year. A couple lost on a dark road sounds like the start to every horror story, so it's fitting that that's actually where this begins. It was early November, cold, raining, and around midnight. My fiancé and I like taking spontaneous late-night drives. We typically start out on one of the main roads within our city and keep following it until we hit the next town. Sometimes our drives last hours. The layout of my county and surrounding counties is a little bizarre. All of the cities and towns are isolated by large spreads of woods and country. I live in a relatively large college town, but a half-hour drive in one direction can land you stranded on a jagged, unmarked gravel road in the middle of nowhere, or in one of those weird small villages that no one knows about. It's actually pretty exciting, and that's exactly why we do it so much. So it's midnight and we're nearly lost. Willa, my fiancé, is poking around on my phone, trying to figure out what road we're on. We were on a mud path in a pit of country framed by small towns that we've never heard of. Flory, Winnica, and Tell or something. There were no other cars on the road. It's rainy and misty, and the headlights on my car aren't doing a damn thing. There are stands of trees and brush on either side of the road. We were heading north. She tells me that she thinks we're going to cross 200 Street West, which turns into Rye Road, which is a straight shot to Winnica. We made our way down the mud road for about a half an hour and never hit it. We've always had fun on these sorts of drives. This is the first time we've ever really been on edge. Willis says that we should have already found 200 Street West already, and asked if we passed it without noticing. I nervously ask if we should turn around, but she doesn't think we can without backing up into a tree or a ditch. I'm driving a Mazda, and it's an awfully wide turn. She begins to bite her nails while scrolling down on Google Maps. 10 minutes pass and we finally see a little back road snaking up a hill, branching off of the road that we're on. I quickly turn down it. It's very narrow, and twigs and branches are raking the doors and windows of my car. We complete the climb up the road, and we find ourselves in a wide paved clearing, with a house at the back of it, tucked into the woods. Willa doesn't miss a beat and starts hissing for me to turn around. The headlights illuminate the whole property, which is in major despair. No lights, windows shattered, siding and shingles shredded. The yard is littered with scraps and trash, barrels, car parts, tools, hundreds of glass bottles, branches, slabs of concrete and rocks, and there is also a nasty old Chevy pickup. It looks like the house is sitting on top of all of it. Every inch of the property is entangled in nets of ivy and weeds. Willa points out moving shadows and glowing spots around the yard. There are dozens of cats all around, and they're all looking at us, and their eyes are glimmering from the headlights. I almost piss myself when a walnut-sized rock darts out of the bush and pops against the windshield. It fractures the glass. Willa screams and grabs my arm. "Denny, what the hell was that? Oh my God, what happened?" The rain is pouring in streams down the trees, over the house, and across the pavement. All the blood runs from my face. After a few seconds, a man stumbles out from the bushes and weeds, and he's carrying a fucking shovel. He was wearing a big dirty navy coat and has a beard. Then the screen door on the house opens up, and all the cats scatter. A tall, thin, spidery woman crawls out onto the porch. She had long, wild gray hair. She's just up high enough on the porch that the headlights don't reach her eyes. She whips her unusually dark hands on her skirt. I have no clue what was on her hands, but that's what I remember the most about her, how dark her hands were. She stares at us. Willa is screaming and crying and slapping the door lock repeatedly. I throw the car into reverse, rolling over cinder blocks and branches, and then screech back down the road. After Willa stops crying, and there's some distance between us and the house, I start to relax. Yet, when I get out of the woods and hit a long, straight stretch of road, I notice headlights behind us. I get a stomachache when I notice the car is mimicking all of our turns onto different roads. After nearly half an hour of being pursued, we finally reach Flory and pull into a gas station being visited by a few other people. I watch the vehicle pass. It's that same nasty Chevy truck we saw at the house. They stalked us all the way to the next town. We waited till the truck disappeared down the road before we got out. We grabbed some food and asked for directions. On our way home, I looked in the rearview mirror more times than I did at the road ahead. When we got back early the next morning, my teeth didn't stop chattering until I fell asleep. Thankfully, we still have night road trips and run into some really weird and cool things. We haven't encountered anything to top that creep though. Since telling our families about it, we've been told to be a little bit more careful about where we go. We've also stored a knife in the glove box. I also keep my rosary in my car now, in case, I'm dying and need to say a couple of last Hail Marys. I've driven back around that area during the daytime recently, and I've not been able to find it again. I managed to find the mud road that we were on, but I've not yet found the turnoff to that particular residence. My windshield has been fixed. Willa has suggested that we have locations in mind when we go out on night drives, so we're not driving around aimlessly. This story involves my encounter with a serial killer in 1996. I was 22 years old at the time and living in Terrebonne, Louisiana. I was living with my cousin and we were doing construction work, and our existence revolved around getting trashed on the weekends. One Friday night we went out with a coworker named Josh. We met Josh at this house in Huma and headed out. We hit the bars and I was determined to get laid. By 1 a.m., I had completely struck out for the night. I was at the point of my alcohol consumption that I wasn't going to have any success with the ladies. So we headed back to Josh's, and couldn't manage to find our way back in our drunken states. We ended up in a section of town none of us had been to before. We came across another bar and Josh convinces us it's a good idea to go inside. Within 30 seconds of entering the bar, it's very obvious that it's a gay bar. None of us were gay, but we agreed with some prodding from Josh that we would stay and have a few drinks. I started getting advanced on by a heavy-set man. I make it apparent as quickly as possible that I'm not gay and that he should leave. He seems to accept this but continues to spark up conversation with me. I find him somewhat interesting, mainly due to his open sexuality, which I was new to. About a half hour goes by and the bar is dying down, and we continue chatting. He says that he lives nearby and that all three of us can crash with him and head out in the morning. At this point, he hadn't set off any alarm bells, especially in my drunken state. I convinced Josh and my cousin that the guy is cool and we can have a nice place to stay the night that's nearby. They eventually trust my judgment and we head out. We soon find ourselves in a small trailer park. We get to his trailer and things started to get fucking weird. He had a giant bulletin board with pictures of men on it. Under the men's pictures were descriptions like loose fuck, rugged butt, white boy tight ass tents, and so forth. Just weird shit. My cousin even comments on it, and he said that he likes to remember his partners. Oh, okay. Now please keep in mind that we were hammered out of our fucking minds, and we were just too drunk to give a shit and just wanted this night to be over with. In the middle of the night, about 4 a.m., we were woken up by him screaming,
"If you're gonna sleep in my house, you're gonna have to pay."
We naturally asked him what the fuck he was doing, but he insists that we were teasing him and wanted a good fucking. We eventually calmed him down and promptly got the fuck out of there. About 7 years later, I realized that the man was Ronald Dominique, who was eventually convicted of 23 murders of homosexual men. This was in 1996. I often struggle with guilt over if I should have done something and contacted the police based on the weird vibes he gave off and his inappropriate behavior. At the time of his conviction, I had long moved from Louisiana and was living in Northern Oregon. On a dark, cold night in the late 1970s, my dad's truck broke down about an hour from home. He started walking and put his thumb out hitching for a ride and was soon picked up by a middle-aged man in a brown sedan. My dad gets in the car. "Hey, thanks man, I appreciate the lift." The driver didn't respond. "I'm heading further up north. Where are you heading?" The driver again does not reply and begins to drive. Without even looking at him, the driver locks the doors and puts his hand on my dad's upper thigh and squeezes. My dad was about 24 or 25 years old at the time. He worked in construction, specifically drywall. He wasn't a tall man, but he was barrel-chested and stocky. My dad turns to face him. "I'm not into that, man. I just need a ride." The driver doesn't move his hand. After about 10 seconds of silence, my dad says, "Let me out of the car." Again, the driver doesn't respond. Doesn't even look at him. My dad grabs his hand and peels it off his thigh. "Let me out of the car, motherfucker. I will kick your fucking ass. Let me out now." My dad was ready to strike. Again, without a word and without even looking at him, the driver pulls over, unlocks the door, and my dad jumps out. He then peels off. My dad eventually arrives home and tells everyone about what happened. His family doesn't believe him. A few years later, he's dating my mom. They were watching the news, which was covering the arrest of a serial killer, John Wayne Gacy. My mom said my dad went pale. My dad jumps out of his chair, shaking violently, and started screaming and pointing at the TV. "That's him. That's the guy who picked me up." My mom said that she believed him immediately. My dad wasn't much of a liar or a prankster. He was blunt, rather quiet, and didn't really crave attention. I was so intrigued by this incident that in the late 90s I read a few books on Gacy, including the one written based on his interviews. Gacy picked up countless hitchhikers over a multi-year period in the 1970s. Sometimes he would pick up hitchhikers and take them wherever they wanted to go, without incident. The timeline, details, and geography, the MOs are all consistent. My theory is that Gacy picked up my dad thinking he was younger than he actually was, and then he tested out my dad's reaction. My dad was a bit older than Gacy's target age of 18 to 20. When my dad fought back aggressively and immediately, Gacy figured he wasn't worth the trouble, and possibly also realized that my dad was not as young as he looked. A few years ago, my partner and I were at an event, and we started chit-chatting with a couple seated at our table. The female of the couple turned white and stared at me, mouth agape. She told me that her uncle had an almost identical encounter with Gacy. I just feel so bad for those who were unable to escape. Growing up, I would occasionally ask my mother if she had any real-life scary stories she could tell me. She chose not to mention this one until I was old enough to hear it. When my now-deceased grandmother, my mother's mother, was in her early 30s, she decided to drive to our town's convenience store after dark to pick up a couple of things. She had finally just managed to get her 4 children to sleep and left my grandfather to take over while she hopped in a car and made the 10-minute drive. Back then, the road from their house to the store had very few neighbors and was mostly just woods on either side of the 2 lanes. After buying the couple of things she needed, she left the store and jumped back into her car, pulling out onto the road for her route home. A minute into the drive, she routinely checks her rearview mirror. Instead of seeing the usual empty road or a set of headlights, reflecting back was a man's face in the back seat. Scared to death, she instantly hits the brakes, hard enough to shock this man, probably giving him whiplash. She then jumps out of the car and begins screaming loud enough so the people near the store could hopefully hear. Having this man's plan foiled, whatever his plan entailed, he took this opportunity to escape the car, running into the woods and out of sight. After getting back from the store and calling the police, my grandfather found a cloth covered in chloroform in the back seat. It was 2012, and my best friend Hannah had convinced me to join her on a weekend trip up north. After searching for the longest time, she had found her dream car and was planning on traveling the 900 kilometers to the very north of Sweden to buy it. It was a second-hand 2-door Suzuki Vitara in a purplish kind of color, and I must admit, I did not share her obsession with it. But with her being the closest thing to a sister that I will ever get, I was happy to join her nonetheless. Hannah and I have always had each other, from the cradle and onwards, sharing each other's love for adventure. We traveled the world together. At the time this happened, we were both 21 and had recently returned from a trip to Asia. The man who was selling her the car had agreed to meet us at the small airport in Umeå. When we arrived shortly before lunchtime, it had started to snow heavily, the first snow of the season no less. The parking lot was almost empty when I saw the man standing outside the Vitara. I felt immediately concerned. He was dressed like a hunter. A lot of people in this area of the country live a lifestyle with fishing and hunting, so there was nothing really strange about that. But still, there was just something about him that made me uneasy. He was really nice though, smiling and waving to us, and shaking our hands before walking us around the car and pointing out all the tiny little flaws. He showed us the work he had done on the car, and showed us the paperwork from the recently done engine repairs. He gave the impression that he didn't want to hide anything. On the contrary, he made a show out of being very forthcoming and honest. The snowing had now intensified, and we were getting cold. He opened the car door for us and said, "I got the paperwork at home. Let's close the deal over some coffee." Against all my instincts, I climbed in after Hannah, the both of us now trapped in the back seat. I had no reason to feel threatened by this man, who had been nothing but pleasant to us, other than the alarm bells going off inside my head. I can't tell what it is that made me feel that way, but there must have been some sign that something was wrong, something that my subconscious had picked up on. The man was constantly talking. Funny, since people from the north of Scandinavia are famous for never speaking a word more than absolutely necessary. He showed us the stereo, told us about the features of the car, about the places we drove past, about the wildlife and nature, There was not a silent moment. After about 20 minutes, I started to notice that we were in no way moving in the direction of civilization. Instead, it seemed we were driving further and further away into the vast wilderness. It struck me that he had us in the back of a two-door car, driving us into an unknown territory, and no one knew where we were. I looked at Hannah, who was happily listening to the man telling us stories about the area, and noticed that she didn't look at all worried. Maybe I was totally overreacting. We drove past a group of people standing by the side of the road, hunters planning their day or taking a break maybe. This is truly a very different Sweden compared to the city. The car finally stopped outside a small wooden cottage with no neighboring houses, apart from a small cabin that we drove past a few hundred meters down the road, but it had looked like it was empty. We followed the man inside. He was still talking non-stop and continued to do so until the moment the door closed behind us. Hannah kept asking things about the car, and I could sense that her voice had a new undertone now. A thin, sharp tenseness that made me wonder if she too started to feel that something wasn't right. "I'll put the kettle on," he said. As he passed us to go into the kitchen, he let his hand touch Hannah's hair, and then he smiled, smugly. "May I use your bathroom?" I asked politely, and made my way to a door with a little red heart on it. I was washing my hands when I saw something in the stained bathroom mirror. Something was hidden behind the water cistern. I pulled out a rolled-up plastic folder, and as I turned the pages, I felt my blood run cold. It was very violent porn pictures that looked like they had been cut out from magazines. They were glued together to the paper, surrounded by cut-out pieces of handwritten text. Put together, it made a horrifying story about how a woman was lured in a car with the promise of getting to buy the car cheaply, and then it quickly turned into a horror story. I know this is going to sound silly, but when we traveled together, Hannah and I had a code word for whenever we felt it was time to get out of a situation. We had never needed to use it, just joked about it, but now it came in handy. I walked out of the bathroom and looked at Hannah and said, "Potatoes. We forgot to buy potatoes, and that's too bad, because good God, we need some." The look on my face must have told her that the situation was no joke, and she said, "Oh, should we get some as soon as possible?" "The sooner the better," I replied. Hannah, always pretty and charming, and capable of great acting, casually walked over to the man in the kitchen, tapped him on his shoulder and said, "Excuse me, but I was wondering if I can go have a quick look at the cam belt." He said something about it being in good shape and handed over the keys. We got into the car and sped off. We left the car at the airport and hoped we hadn't made a terrible mistake. What if he reported it stolen? It would be embarrassing to explain to the police. But nothing happened. He didn't follow us, didn't report it in. We had to take the train since we no longer had plane tickets. The original plan was to take the car home, and we didn't want to linger close to the airport in case he came looking for us. Later, Hannah asked me what made me use the code word, and I told her about what I found. It might have just been a fantasy or a sick game, and maybe he never would have done anything to us. But right then and there, I was convinced that we would die if we didn't get out. Thank God Hannah didn't need any convincing or proof, just the code word. I truly think that if we hadn't talked about it so many times before, about how we would handle a situation where we needed to get out fast, things would have ended much differently. Both of us knew that if we ever used the code word, it was time to get out. No questions asked. Just move. I'm a 21-year-old female, and my name is Shauna. I grew up in a little town in the Boston area. Back in my hometown of having about 3,000 people, everyone knew everyone, and nobody locked their doors. Because of the no crime to little petty crime there was, this is important to remember. I had just moved to Las Vegas, Nevada with my family. I live with my mom, dad, 2 sisters, and 2 dogs. I just moved here about 3 weeks ago. I'm a huge zombie fan and a doomsday prepper. Please don't judge me. So I have a collection of knives and machetes on my wall. In my new house, me and my sister's rooms are all upstairs in one corner. My parents' room is right across next to the stairs and bathroom. Once you go downstairs, you're in front of the main entrance. Past the front door is the living room, and then the kitchen with a sliding glass door that leads to the backyard. My dogs are usually outside, but I've not learned how to use the doggy door yet. My dogs do not like anyone who are not the 5 people in my family. All of this is important information. Now let's get to what happened. I was still behind on unpacking, so I was in my room trying to figure out where to put all my stuff. My older sister started college and was on a softball team, and she had a game that Saturday night. I hear my mother come up the stairs and knock on my door. "Hey, you want to take a break and come to Alex's game tonight?" No, I'm okay. I'm gonna continue unpacking. How long are you guys gonna be? Is everyone going?" "Yeah, we're all going. Maybe 2 hours tops. Will you be okay?" Yeah, I'll be fine. Remember to let the dogs out and call if you need anything." My mom leaves and I hear the car drive off. I am now home alone, but I don't think much of it since I'm 21 years old and I can handle myself. I really had no idea how much I was going to be put to the test that Saturday night. I was watching a scary movie and folding my clothes when I hear a car pull up next to my house. We moved into a dead-end street, but where I used to live was a main road, so this kind of freaked me out because I wasn't used to hearing cars slow down near my home. I brushed it off as a neighbor and that I was just being paranoid in a new house. As I'm going to put some things in my bathroom, something caught the corner of my eye outside the window. I went over and opened the window, listening for anything, but I could hear and see nothing. However, I thought I saw someone run behind the big-ass cactus on the side of my house. I go back in my room and see a light flash by my window, kind of like a flashlight. My room light was off, so it was really bright, but I assumed it was headlights or something, even though I couldn't hear a car running. Later I walked downstairs to get something to drink and let my dogs out, completely ignoring the red flags as some people call them. I let my dogs stay outside while I finish upstairs so they can run around. Back at my old house, my dogs didn't have a lot of freedom since we lived on a busy main road with no fence, so then I walked back up to my room and locked my bedroom door. I lay in bed, and I guess I fell asleep. I was asleep for maybe about an hour when I heard my front door open. I thought my parents had come home early, or perhaps it was my little sister, so I thought nothing of it and went back to sleep. But then I heard 2 sets of heavy footsteps, and then the doorknob to my room started to jingle. My parents always knock and announce themselves before opening my door, so I knew something wasn't right and bolted straight up. Then I heard a female voice from the other side of the door softly say, "Shit, it's locked. Why would it be locked? I thought you said no one was home." "I don't know. Jesus, shut up. It's probably locked with a key and they went with the family. I told you all 4 people left in the same car. I'm not stupid. Who gives a fuck? Let's try another one." I froze, nearly shat my pants. 4 people. 4 fucking people. So they've been watching my house and have no idea there's a 5th person in the family. I just moved here, so I have no friends, and there shouldn't be anyone in my house besides my family. I'm breathing heavily and covering my mouth so they can't hear me, tears streaming down my cheeks. I get up and move towards my wall. As I mentioned earlier, I have a knife collection, so I went and grabbed my biggest machete, and I walked to my door, putting my ear against it to listen. It's quiet, so I quietly unlock it at the same moment I hear my parents' door opening, and I take a quick look to try to size up my opponent. There was a man, maybe about 5'11", 150 pounds, wearing all black with a ski mask, and a female, maybe about 5'5", and 120 pounds, wearing the same exact thing, except you could see her knotted, gross red hair. They both had bags. So I run to the bathroom, right next to my room, trying to inch my way towards the stairs so I could get to the front door. I came up with the best idea ever. "I have a machete, and I called the police. You better run," I yelled at them. I didn't call the police. I should have, though. Fear makes you do the stupidest things, I swear. And I'm also only 5'4", 125 pounds, not intimidating in the slightest. Then I heard the female say, "Shit, Ryan, what the fuck? You said there was only 4 people in the family. How could you fuck this up again? And the girl has a machete. What should we do with her? Take her with us?" Apparently, Ryan responded, "I swear I thought there was only 4. I guess we'll have to. She'll call the cops. I wasn't having any of this in my own goddamn home. I apparently grew some balls. Rather than being scared, I was more furious to hear that. No fucking way they are taking me anywhere or touching me. I got so mad that anger got in the way of the smart thing to do, and I yelled back something so stupid, I'm still mad I even said it. I put myself in more danger. You ain't doing shit with me, you stupid assholes. Get the fuck out of my house before I fuck you up. So stupid. I then ran down the stairs as fast as my little legs could carry me without falling, turning all the lights on as I hear them following me down the stairs after me. As I round the corner by the front door, the girl grabs my arm and yanks me back to the ground. While trying to hold my hands behind my back, the guy tries to tie my hand with rope from his bag. Oh, some of my friends are gonna like a young girl like you. I promise we'll take good care of you, he said with an evil smile that seemed to stretch on forever. His teeth were yellow and black, and his breath smelled like garbage and death. The girl, smiling in the same way, leaned in and said, "Aw, don't be scared. I promise you'll have lots of fun." But I guess they forgot I had the big-ass machete, and I twisted my arm free and cut the guy's forearm from wrist to elbow. Blood went everywhere. It soaked me and the girl from head to toe. As he started screaming and clutching his arm, I kicked the girl in her stomach and started to run for my back door to let my mean-ass dogs in. But as I was jumping over the child gate we used to keep my dogs in the kitchen, the girl grabbed my leg, which causes both of us to tumble to the floor, and my machete skids across the kitchen. I felt completely helpless seeing my only weapon about 5 feet away from me. So close, but so far. I've always made fun of people for saying that they had a fight or flight moment, but that's exactly what happened. I chose to fight. This is my goddamn house. I just started throwing punches, trying to do everything I could to get this disgusting, BO-smelling girl off of me. She gets the upper hand and flips me on my back, so that now she's straddling me and takes her hands and puts them around my neck and starts squeezing. She squeezed so hard I could feel my eyes unnaturally coming out of their sockets. I felt my whole body go warm, like I was outside on a hot summer morning. So hot, I just started sweating, gasping for air, my vision going blurry, head throbbing like a million needles are pricking the inside of my skull. I feel my heart beat in my head and hands, slowly accepting my fate, seeing my childhood, becoming sad that I will never see my family again. I will never play with my dogs again. Everything was sad, not painful. At the same time, I just knew right then and there, I was dead. I'm crying and screaming, looking for anything to stab her with. I am completely filled with sadness, but all of a sudden, the most beautiful sound comes, and I start crying tears of joy, even though I cannot breathe, and I'm about to pass out from lack of oxygen. The sound was of the dog door opening and closing. My big-ass mean dogs have figured it out. They must have been watching from the glass door and ran around the house looking for a way in, and found it. As I'm seeing stars and I'm about to black out, my dog jumps over me and grabs the girl's arm by his teeth and starts tearing it to shreds. At this moment, the guy sees she's in trouble and starts to get up, which surprises me since he's lost a lot of blood. But before he gets a chance to do anything, my second dog walks up and starts growling. As I'm laying on the floor, gasping for air like a fish out of water, my whole body feels like pins and needles, and really burning hot. I muster all the power I can, and I walk, pick up my machete, and say, in a very low and raspy voice, "Don't fucking move." Since I didn't call the cops in the bathroom, I grabbed my phone off the kitchen table. Thank God it was still there from where I ate lunch earlier that day. While still holding my machete, I rang the police. The whole time, I never told my dog to stop tearing that girl's arm apart. I wanted that bitch to die. I didn't care since she almost killed me. That bitch deserved it, and I still think that to this day. When the police got there, they arrested the both of them and had me come out to a cop car to call my parents while they took pictures and did an investigation. My parents showed up crying and worried. They drove me to the hospital where I found out the worst of my injuries. I had 2 broken ribs, a sprained wrist and foot, a broken nose, cuts and bruises all over my body, and 3 broken fingers. I stayed in the hospital for 4 days, and right before I was released, the cops who came to my house that night came to visit me for a follow-up. The couple were boyfriend and girlfriend, who would wander neighborhoods looking for for sale signs and stalk the houses until someone moved in, then would stalk them longer to know when everyone left and how many people lived there. I guess they didn't realize that I didn't go with my family that night, or thought there were only 4 people in my family, and clearly didn't realize I had 2 big dogs. Once they felt they knew the setup, they would break in, except in my case, walk in and raid the place for money and anything to pawn. They were also wanted for kidnapping, assault and battery with a deadly weapon, burglary, and drug charges. And the guy was also wanted for 3 rape charges. The kidnapping and rape is what really scared me. I now know what would have happened if I actually passed out. I wish I could say they went away for decades, but no, they only got 5 years. After I got out of the hospital, my dogs got new beds, toys, and treats, and all the love I could give them. They saved my life, and I am forever grateful for them. I couldn't imagine what would have happened if 1, my bedroom door wasn't locked, 2, if I didn't have my dogs, and 3, if I wasn't a doomsday prepper. I'm pretty sure they had something bad planned for me.
There's always a reason to be afraid.